My name is Kimberly Hughes. I am 32 years old. Yesterday afternoon, I stood in my kitchen and held my phone with shaking hands while my grandfather, still wearing his plastic hospital wristband, listened to his own son ask how fast we could clear out his house. I had just taken a breath and said the words, "Dad, Grandpa passed away last night." My father did not ask if he suffered. He did not ask if I was alone at the hospital. He took a sip of whatever he was drinking, the ice clinking clearly through the speakerphone, and asked where I put the estate keys. Then my brother grabbed the receiver to remind me he was getting everything, and my mother started planning the estate sale. They thought they were talking to the invisible, obedient daughter they had walked all over for 3 decades. They had no idea my grandfather was sitting right next to me, listening to every single word, or what he would whisper to me before I ended the call. Welcome back to Zara Told Stories. If you have ever been the family doormat who finally decided to change the locks, you will want to hear how this ends. Take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. And I would love to know, how old are you and what state are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. Now let me take you into the room where my family signed their own ruin. The smell of sterile hospital soap and rubbing alcohol still clung to my grandfather's jacket. We had just driven back from the cardiac care unit in Lancaster. The doctors said it was a severe palpitation, a warning sign, but Wallace was cleared to go home as long as he rested. The drive through the rolling Pennsylvania hills had been quiet. The autumn rain hit the windshield in heavy gray sheets. Wallace stared out the passenger window, watching the farmlands pass by, tracing the edge of his seatbelt with pale, weathered fingers. He built a regional manufacturing firm from the ground up, turning raw Appalachian steel into a life of quiet comfort. He knew exactly who his son was, and he knew exactly who my brother was. When I pulled my car into the driveway of my townhouse, Wallace did not unbuckle his seatbelt right away. He turned his head slowly. The lines around his eyes looked deeper than they had that morning. He looked at me and asked a question that shifted the foundation of my entire life. "Would you like to test them with me?" I did not need him to clarify who they were. We walked inside. I draped a thick wool blanket over his shoulders and settled him into the chair by the kitchen island. The house was dead quiet, save for the rain drumming against the back patio door. I unlocked my phone screen. My thumb hovered over my father's contact name. Wallace gave me one firm nod. I hit call and pressed the speaker icon. Charles answered on the third ring. His voice carried that brisk, impatient tone he reserved specifically for me, a tone that always suggested my phone calls were keeping him from something much more important. "What is it, Kimberly?" I forced my throat to tighten. I let my voice crack just enough to sound like a woman standing in the wreckage of a fresh loss. "Dad, Grandpa passed away last night." I waited for the silence. I waited for the sharp intake of breath, the sudden softening of his voice, maybe even a crack in his rigid corporate armor. What came through the speaker instead was a quiet scoff. "So the old man finally died." I stopped breathing. Across the island, Wallace closed his eyes. Charles cleared his throat. "Did you leave his car at the hospital? We need to secure the physical property before the end of the week." "Where are the estate keys, Kimberly?" A new voice overlapped his. Derek. My younger brother must have been sitting in the same room. He did not ask for the phone. He simply shouted toward it. "Tell her not to touch the safe. Grandpa left the manufacturing shares to me. You do not get a thing, Kim. Just box up his office and stay out of the paperwork." The sound of a chair scraping against hard wood echoed through the line. Valerie, my mother, stepped closer to the receiver. I could practically see her manicured fingers tapping against the edge of a wineglass. "We need to contact the Regional Preservation Board about the historic farmhouse," she said, her voice bright and urgent. "If we clear out that Appalachian antique clutter by Friday, we can list the property before the end of the fiscal quarter. The market is peaking right now. I stared at the black screen of my phone. 3 people. 3 blood relatives. Less than 60 seconds after hearing their patriarch had died, they had already stripped him down to his real estate value and divided the spoils. They were not mourning a father or a grandfather. They were celebrating a windfall. I looked at Wallace. I expected to see a broken man. I expected tears. Instead, my grandfather sat perfectly upright. The exhaustion had vanished from his posture. His pale blue eyes were sharp, bright, and unforgiving. He leaned closer to the phone resting on the quartz countertop. "Let them dig their own graves," he whispered. I tapped the red button. The line went dark. The silence rushed back into my kitchen, heavy and thick. I stood there staring at the device in my hand. For 32 years, I had played my assigned role. I remembered birthdays. I organized holiday dinners. I drove 3 hours in the snow to drop off tax documents because Charles could not be bothered to use the mail. I let Derek take credit for ideas I fed him. I let Valerie criticize my clothes, my apartment, my life, because I thought absorbing their sharp edges was the rent I had to pay to keep a family intact. I realized in that exact moment that there was no family to keep intact. I was just unpaid administration for a syndicate that shared my last name. But Charles, Valerie, and Derek had made a critical miscalculation. They saw my quietness as weakness. They saw my obedience as a lack of intelligence. They forgot what I actually do for a living every single day. I am a senior supply chain auditor. My entire career is built on finding discrepancies. I track stolen corporate assets across state lines. I dismantle fraudulent logistics networks. I sit in rooms with powerful men who think they have hidden their crimes perfectly, and I unravel their entire lives using a single, mismatched invoice. If my family wanted to treat my grandfather's legacy like a hostile corporate takeover, they were welcome to try. But they were no longer dealing with the obedient daughter. They had just initiated a war against a woman who builds traps for a living. I walked over to my work bag sitting by the door. I unzipped the front pocket and pulled out my heavy red auditing pen. I looked at Wallace, and for the first time that day, I smiled. My phone vibrated against the quartz counter less than 15 minutes after I terminated the first call. Charles was calling back. I let the screen flash 3 times to establish a rhythm of control, then answered. His voice was sharp, stripped of the initial shock, operating entirely on logistics. He wanted the name of the funeral director. He wanted the exact address of the morgue. He wanted the intake paperwork immediately. Bureaucracy is a beautiful weapon if you know how to wield it. In the corporate world, red tape is an annoying obstacle. In warfare, it is a titanium shield. I lowered my voice, adopting the precise, detached tone I use when informing logistics managers their supply chains are broken. I told him the hospital had triggered an automatic hold on the remains. A sudden cardiac event outside a registered hospice setting requires a mandatory coroner review. It was strict state protocol. There would be no release of the body for a minimum of 7 days. The silence that followed was heavy with frantic calculation. I could picture Charles standing in his pristine suburban home, his mind racing through calendars and quarter-end deadlines. 7 days was a disaster for him. A certified death certificate is the legal key that unlocks the probate courts. Without that specific piece of paper, he could not legally transfer the manufacturing shares, he could not list the farmhouse, and he could not step into the role of acting chief executive. He needed to lock down the estate before the board of directors started asking questions on Monday morning. 7 days meant he had to find a back door. He snapped at me, citing his personal attorneys and threatening to call the hospital director to bypass the red tape. I simply reminded him that Pennsylvania state law does not care about his golf handicap. I pressed the end call button. I needed to buy groceries to stock the fridge for Wallace. I pulled up my banking application on my phone to check my balances before heading to the market. A bright red banner flashed across the top of my screen. Account restricted. Please contact your branch administrator. A cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. I dialed the customer service number. The representative on the other end used a soft, practiced voice designed for grieving families. She expressed her deepest sympathies for my loss. Then she explained that my father had walked into a local branch 30 minutes ago and submitted an emergency medical power of attorney. Citing my extreme emotional distress over the sudden death in the family, Charles requested a temporary freeze on all linked accounts for my own protection. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the wall. My father had forged a medical power of attorney. He had actually fabricated a legal document, walked into a financial institution, and weaponized my supposed grief to freeze my checking savings and emergency funds. He understood that contesting the freeze would require hiring a lawyer, which I could no longer afford to do because he had locked away my money. He wanted to paralyze me financially so I could not interfere with his looting of the estate. He assumed I would panic break down and crawl to him for an allowance, forcing me to sign whatever proxy forms he placed in front of me, just to pay my rent. It was a brutal, calculated escalation. It was the move of a man who viewed his own daughter as a mild inconvenience to be starved out of the siege. But Charles made one fatal error. He assumed his victim was dead, and he assumed his daughter was weak. I turned around. The scent of roasted turkey and sharp Dijon mustard drifted through the room. Wallace sat comfortably at my kitchen island. He was not resting in a morgue drawer. He was wearing a soft gray cashmere sweater, meticulously assembling a sandwich on toasted sourdough bread. The dramatic irony was so thick, it felt like a physical weight in the room. Across town, my father was tearing apart the legal framework of our family, operating under the delusion of a corpse, while the corpse himself asked me if I had any sharp cheddar cheese in the crisper drawer. My phone vibrated again. A new voicemail from Charles. I set the device on the counter and hit the speaker button. Charles sounded frantic, his voice tight with panic. He babbled about managing the crisis, securing the perimeter of the farmhouse, and hiring a private security firm to keep the local press away from the property. He demanded I stop being hysterical and answer his calls immediately. Wallace took a slow, deliberate bite of his sandwich. He chewed thoughtfully, his pale blue eyes fixed on the phone, as his son dug a deeper hole with every spoken word. The juxtaposition was stunning. The man they were rushing to bury was currently critiquing the quality of my deli meat. Wallace swallowed his food and reached down to the heavy leather travel bag resting by his feet. He unbuckled the brass straps and pulled out 3 thick black leather-bound books. These were not the sanitized corporate records Charles had access to in the downtown office. These were the shadow ledgers. The personal, handwritten accounts Wallace had kept for 40 years, tracking every true dollar, every handshake deal, and every piece of heavy machinery in his Pennsylvania factories. He slid the heavy books across the polished quartz. "Find the leak," he said quietly. I opened my work tote. My fingers brushed past the useless frozen debit cards and found the smooth, weighted barrel of my favorite tool. A heavy metal auditing pen filled with crimson ink. For years I used this exact pen to mark supply chain discrepancies, highlight fraudulent invoices, and fire corrupt regional managers. It was an instrument of truth. I uncapped it. The metal cap clicked sharply against the barrel. I pulled the first ledger toward me and opened it to the current fiscal year. The pages smelled like old paper and machine oil. I did not cry over my frozen bank accounts. I did not mourn the father who just tried to ruin me. I began to cross-reference Charles's forged timeline against the real numbers. My eyes scanned the columns of dates, routing numbers, and equipment depreciations. Within 10 minutes, the red ink began to flow. A missing wire transfer here, an unauthorized withdrawal there. Charles had been treating the manufacturing company like a personal automated teller machine long before today. The audit had officially begun, and I was going to follow the money until it led to a prison cell. I turned the page, ready to dig deeper into the financial rot, when a loud, frantic pounding echoed from my front door. Someone had found us. The sudden pounding against my front door rattled the glass panes in their wooden frames. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of someone who believed they owned whatever stood on the other side. I glanced at the security monitor mounted by the pantry. Derek stood on my front porch. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, shifting his weight from one Italian leather shoe to the other. My younger brother had always moved like a man running out of time, driven by an internal engine of unearned entitlement. I turned to Wallace. We had 30 seconds. I pointed toward the basement door. My grandfather understood the silent command instantly. He gathered his shadow ledgers, moving with a quiet urgency that belied his age, and descended the carpeted stairs into my secure lower suite. I pulled the door shut, locked the deadbolt, and smoothed my expression into a mask of hollow, fragile grief. I turned the brass knob. Derek pushed past me before the door fully cleared the frame. A wave of overpowering cedar cologne washed into my entryway, doing a very poor job of masking the sour scent of nervous sweat radiating from his collar. He paced straight into my living room, his eyes darting around as if taking an inventory of my furniture for a fire sale. Derek was the golden boy of our bloodline. While I spent my teenage years auditing inventory for local charities to pad my college applications, Derek was crashing imported sedans that Charles quietly replaced the following week. He possessed the kind of dangerous confidence that only comes from knowing someone else will always pay the bill. The family rewarded his recklessness by granting him a vice president title at the manufacturing firm, a role he treated like a personal slush fund. Today, however, the golden boy looked frayed at the edges. His tie was loosened, and a faint tremor shook his right hand as he pointed at my kitchen island. "Where are the executor files, Kim?" he demanded, not bothering with a greeting. "Dad said you handle all the administrative overflow for the firm. Hand them over. We need to streamline the transition." I kept my hands folded loosely in front of me, projecting the image of a bewildered, heartbroken sister. "Transition to what, Derek? The hospital has not even released the death certificate. There is a mandatory state hold. You cannot transfer anything today." He let out a harsh breath, pacing a tight circle on my hardwood floor. "It does not matter. Dad is using the medical directive to bypass the holding period. I am already in talks with a private equity firm out of Philadelphia. They want the manufacturing shares. They are ready to gut the regional factories and sell the scrap. I just need the original incorporation documents to finalize the transfer." He stopped pacing and leaned against the counter, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the quartz edge. "They are wiring the deposit on Monday. I need that cash by Monday, Kim. Do you understand?" I let his words hang in the air, allowing my auditor brain to process the raw data he just handed me. My mind immediately categorized the variables. A sudden demand for liquidity, a fabricated story about a corporate buyout, the physical manifestation of severe stress in a man who usually never broke a sweat. Private equity firms in Philadelphia do not close regional manufacturing acquisitions in 3 days. They take months to conduct due diligence audit, environmental liabilities, and review union contracts. Derek was not executing a corporate merger. He was lying. He was trying to liquidate stolen property to cover a personal catastrophe. A shadowed debt had him sweating through his expensive silk shirt. Then the fragile illusion of our deception nearly broke. A low, muffled cough echoed upward from beneath our feet. It traveled clearly through the aluminum HVAC vent situated directly above the kitchen island. Derek froze. His frantic energy vanished instantly. His head snapped toward the metal vent, his eyes narrowing into cold, suspicious slits. "What was that?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. The human brain processes threat responses in milliseconds. I did not freeze. I reached out and slammed my palm down on the pulse button of the heavy-duty blender resting on the counter. The machine roared to life. Steel blades shredded the leftover morning ice with a deafening mechanical screech that filled every corner of the kitchen. I dropped my head into my hands, letting my shoulders heave. I forced a jagged, gasping breath into my lungs, producing a hyperventilating sob. I channeled every ounce of the betrayal I felt toward my family into a performance of raw, unfiltered panic. "Please," I gasped over the grinding noise of the ice. "Please stop talking about selling his things. He just died, Derek. He just died." I hit the power switch on the blender. The sudden silence amplified my manufactured crying. Derek took a large step back, his face twisting into a mask of pure revulsion. The men in my family despised unscripted emotion. They viewed female grief as a logistical error, a messy inconvenience that disrupted their pristine schedules. My tears were a weapon, and they worked flawlessly. "Jesus, Kim, pull yourself together," he muttered, running a shaking hand through his gelled hair. "You are useless when you get hysterical. Just give me the paperwork so I can leave." I kept my head down, playing the broken woman who just wanted the conflict to end. I walked over to the wooden credenza near the hallway, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It contained outdated 2018 tax returns for a defunct subsidiary venture that Derek himself had bankrupted years ago. It was a useless stack of paper filled with irrelevant numbers and dead ends. I handed it to him with trembling fingers. He snatched the envelope from my grasp, a triumphant smirk replacing his earlier panic. "See? That was not so hard," he sneered, tapping the envelope against his leg. "Let the men handle the heavy lifting from here on out. Go drink some tea or whatever it is you do." The front door slammed shut a moment later. I stood perfectly still, watching through the front window as he climbed into his luxury SUV and sped away down the rain-slicked street. My tears vanished instantly. My breathing leveled out into a calm, steady rhythm. I turned the deadbolt on the front door and walked back to the kitchen. Derek thought he had bullied a weak sibling into submission. He walked away, grinning, convinced he possessed the keys to the kingdom. In reality, his arrogance had just handed the auditor the exact thread needed to unravel his entire existence. He needed a cash injection by Monday. That meant there was a creditor closing in on him. A dangerous one. If I could trace the source of that intense panic, I could dismantle his financial life before the weekend was over. I unlocked the basement door to check on Wallace. My grandfather stood at the bottom of the stairs, leaning on his cane, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had heard the entire exchange through the floorboards. We needed to secure the real assets before Derek opened that envelope and realized he was holding trash. Charles had the forged power of attorney, and Derek had a desperate need for fast cash. They were going to strip the estate bare by any means necessary. It was time to visit the one lawyer in Philadelphia who could legally erase my brother and my father from the bloodline. We needed to build an impenetrable fortress, and we needed to do it today. The pre-dawn fog clung heavily to the Pennsylvania Turnpike as we drove east toward the towering glass spires of Philadelphia. My grandfather sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. He had traded his soft cashmere sweater for a sharply tailored charcoal suit. It was the armor of an industrialist preparing for a boardroom battle. Neither of us spoke much during the 90-minute transit. The silence felt purposeful, a shared gathering of kinetic energy before a severe impact. We navigated the bustling downtown traffic and pulled into the underground parking garage of a premier corporate law firm on Walnut Street. Arthur Caldwell possessed a corner office on the 42nd floor. Arthur was a brilliant estate attorney who had spent the better part of 3 decades helping Wallace navigate the complex tax codes of the Northeast manufacturing sector. While my father Charles inherited his executive title through sheer genetic luck, Arthur and my grandfather had actually built the legal foundation of the empire side by side. We bypassed the main reception desk, utilizing a private executive elevator my grandfather retained access to. When we pushed open the heavy oak doors of the corner conference room, Arthur was standing by a silver carafe pouring steaming black coffee into a porcelain cup. He wore his usual pristine navy suit, preparing for an early morning deposition. He turned around to greet us, his eyes locked onto the man standing beside me. The porcelain cup slipped from Arthur's grasp. It struck the edge of the mahogany table, sending hot, dark liquid cascading across a stack of legal pads. He did not flinch at the spill. He simply gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white, and stared at the ghost occupying his doorway. Wallace. Arthur exhaled the name as a ragged breath. The firm received a call from Charles yesterday afternoon, stating you suffered a fatal cardiac event. My grandfather stepped further into the room, leaning his weight onto his polished wooden cane. Rumors of my demise have been highly exaggerated, Arthur, and unfortunately, they were manufactured by my own blood. Once the initial shock subsided, we moved efficiently. Arthur locked the conference room doors, ordered his secretary to hold all incoming calls, and instructed us to take our seats. The air in the room shifted from stunned disbelief to razor-sharp professional focus. I unzipped my leather tote and withdrew the master timeline I had compiled the previous night. I laid the documents flat across the dry section of the mahogany table, smoothing the edges with my palms. I uncapped my heavy metal auditing pen and pointed to the first glaring discrepancy. Charles walked into a retail bank branch yesterday and executed a fabricated medical directive I explained, tracing the routing numbers. He used that fraudulent document to freeze my personal accounts. He is attempting to paralyze me financially, so I cannot hire independent legal counsel to challenge his narrative. Arthur picked up the printouts, scanning the dates and signatures. His jaw tightened. The level of premeditated fraud here is staggering. Charles also filed an emergency injunction in probate court late yesterday evening. He cited a critical threat to corporate stability to demand immediate executive control over the manufacturing firm. My chest tightened. The audacity of my father was breathtaking. He was not merely stealing, he was accelerating the theft through the judicial system. What is his exact timeline? I asked. Arthur tapped a manicured fingernail against the legal filing. Charles scheduled an emergency board of directors vote for this coming Friday. He intends to push through a unilateral resolution to liquidate the primary regional factories. He plans to bypass the standard transition protocols by claiming the enterprise faces catastrophic devaluation without swift leadership. We have exactly 5 days before he stands in front of the board and legally dismantles 30 years of labor. 5 days. The ticking clock echoed loudly in my mind. Charles believed the mandatory autopsy hold on the death certificate gave him a protective buffer, a window where nobody could officially verify the state of the estate. He intended to use that artificial chaos to force the board into a panic sale. We are going to remove the asset from the board entirely, Wallace stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. We are going to build a vault they cannot crack. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. An irrevocable blind trust. I understood the legal mechanics instantly. It was the ultimate defensive maneuver in corporate asset protection. Working in absolute, hermetically sealed secrecy, the three of us spent the next 4 hours drafting an ironclad legal structure. We established a new impenetrable trust entity registered under an obscure holding name. The terms were brutally simple. Wallace transferred the entirety of his life's work into this new vehicle. Every single share of stock in the manufacturing firm, the sprawling historic farmlands in Lancaster, the commercial real estate holdings, and all liquid capital were reassigned. We severed the assets from the man himself. Wallace was designated as the living beneficiary, entitled to the yields. However, the sole, unquestionable, legally untouchable trustee was me. I would hold absolute discretionary power over the trust. I could veto any sale, terminate any executive, and freeze any dividend. The beauty of the irrevocable clause meant that even if Charles somehow convinced a judge to declare Wallace mentally unfit down the road, the assets were already gone. They could not be clawed back. They were shielded by a titanium wall of jurisprudence. We printed the final documents on thick, watermarked paper. Arthur brought in 2 senior partners who were sworn to confidentiality to witness the execution. My grandfather took the gold fountain pen Arthur offered him. His hand did not shake. He signed his name across the signature lines with bold, aggressive strokes, legally stripping his son and his grandson of their anticipated kingdom. I took the pen next, affixing my signature as the acting trustee. The gravity of the moment settled deep into my shoulders. I was no longer an invisible daughter quietly fixing spreadsheets in a cubicle. I was the warden of a multi-million-dollar fortress. Every piece of paper Charles and Derek were currently fighting over, back in Lancaster, was now completely, legally worthless. They were viciously wrestling over a treasure chest we had already emptied. I capped my red auditing pen, listening to the satisfying metallic click echo in the quiet conference room. My family was currently climbing a very tall, very dangerous ladder, and they had no idea I had just detached it from the wall. Let them climb to the top. The fall would be spectacular. As Arthur gathered the executed documents to file them under seal, my cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table. The caller identification displayed my mother's name, Valerie. I swiped the screen to accept the call, bringing the device to my ear. Valerie did not offer a greeting. Her voice was clipped, buzzing with the frantic, superficial energy she always utilized when organizing a high society event. "Kimberly, meet me at the Oak Haven Country Club in 1 hour," she commanded. "We have a grieving luncheon scheduled. I need to go over the delegation of your duties for the memorial service, and we have a serious problem with the catering menu. Do not be late." She terminated the connection before I could respond. I looked at my grandfather, sliding my phone back into my pocket. My mother was summoning her unpaid assistant to scrub the floors of her upcoming theatrical performance. She wanted to play the heartbroken widow by proxy, using a country club dining room as her stage. I smiled softly, preparing to step directly into the lion's den. It was time to let my mother delegate her own downfall. The drive from the polished legal sanctuary in downtown Philadelphia back to the manicured perimeter of Lancaster took just over an hour. I left my grandfather resting safely at my townhouse, opting to face the matriarch of our crumbling dynasty alone. The Oak Haven Country Club occupied 200 acres of prime Pennsylvania real estate, a sprawling compound of emerald golf greens and limestone facades where the local elite gathered to compare stock portfolios and trade hushed scandals. Valerie had secured a secluded table on the flagstone terrace overlooking the 18th hole. She wore a tailored black cashmere dress, a subtle nod to her sudden widowhood by proxy, though the garment looked more appropriate for a fashion editorial than a period of mourning. A string of authentic pearls rested against her collarbone. My mother married into the industrial wealth 35 years ago, and spent every waking moment since ensuring the surrounding society believed she was born possessing it. She did not look up when I approached the table. She was too busy inspecting the clarity of her crystal water glass. "Sit down, Kimberly," she instructed, her gaze remaining fixed on the table setting. "We have a monumental amount of ground to cover and a very narrow window of time." I took the seat opposite her, folding my hands in my lap. I wore a simple beige blouse and beige slacks. Over the years, I had perfected the art of blending into the upholstery, allowing my family to view me as a piece of functional furniture. Today, my camouflage served a brilliant purpose. Valerie reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a thick stack of ivory cardstock. She slid the 3 pages across the crisp linen tablecloth. The paper stopped inches from my plate. "That is the preliminary schedule for the memorial service," she stated, her tone brisk and devoid of any warmth. "I need you to coordinate the caterers for 200 guests. You will also draft the press release for the local business journals regarding your father assuming the chief executive role. But your priority is the farmhouse. The staging company arrives on Tuesday morning. You have 48 hours to clear out all of your grandfather's personal clutter so they can paint the interior neutral gray." I stared at the pristine pages. The sheer volume of unpaid labor she expected me to execute was staggering. I was being ordered to pack away a man's entire existence in industrial trash bags so they could flip his historic home for a quick profit. Valerie tapped her manicured index finger against the top page, her acrylic nail making a sharp, rhythmic clicking sound against the wood underneath the linen. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was a trigger yanking me backward through time. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second, replacing the sunlit country club terrace with the dim, freezing interior of our old detached garage. I was 12 years old again. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. The air smelled foul, a nauseating mixture of stomach bile and cheap beer. My older brother Derek had managed to drive his brand new sedan home from a party, stumbling inside to sleep off his intoxication. He had ruined the leather interior of the vehicle. My mother had woken me up handing me a plastic bucket of hot soapy water and a stiff bristle brush. "Family protects family, Kimberly," she had whispered fiercely in the dark hallway. "If your father sees this mess in the morning, he will cut off Derek's allowance. Go clean it up." I had knelt on the cold concrete floor of that garage for 4 hours, scrubbing the floor mats until my knuckles bled. Tucked inside the pocket of my pajamas was a stack of index cards. I had spent 6 months studying for the regional spelling bee, an event scheduled for 8 o'clock that exact same morning. I never made it to the auditorium. I was too exhausted to keep my eyes open. Derek slept until noon. Nobody ever mentioned the spelling bee again. I learned that my ambitions were entirely expendable if they interfered with my brother's comfort. I snapped back to the present. The clicking of the acrylic nails stopped. A young server in a crisp white uniform approached our table, holding a silver tray. "Can I offer you ladies anything from the bar this afternoon?" he asked, with a bright professional smile. Valerie seamlessly shifted gears. The cold, dictatorial matriarch vanished, replaced instantly by the tragic, grieving daughter-in-law. She let her shoulders slump. She pressed a pristine white tissue to the corner of her eye, squeezing out a single, calculated tear that clung perfectly to her lower lashes. "Just sparkling water with a lime twist, thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "We are planning a funeral. It is just too difficult to celebrate anything today." The server's expression dropped into immediate sympathy. "I am so sorry for your loss, ma'am. I will bring that right out." He hurried away. The moment he was out of earshot, Valerie lowered the tissue. Her posture straightened, and the tremor in her voice evaporated. She picked up a silver fork and adjusted its alignment next to her plate. "As I was saying," she continued, not missing a beat, "the farmhouse needs to be immaculate by Tuesday. Do not bother boxing up the Appalachian antique furniture in the primary study. I have already scheduled a private appraiser to come by tomorrow evening to catalog those pieces." Underneath the edge of the linen tablecloth, my right hand slipped into my pocket. My fingers traced the smooth glass of my smartphone screen. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I slid my thumb upward, opened the voice memo application, and pressed the record icon. I maintained a chillingly calm demeanor. I offered a soft, non-committal smile, leaning forward slightly, as if eager to receive instructions. "An appraiser," I repeated, keeping my tone mild and curious. "Is that standard procedure before the courts process the estate?" Valerie let out a dismissive scoff. "We do not have time to wait for the probate courts to drag their feet. The man I hired operates with a high degree of discretion. He specializes in expedited liquidations for prominent families. He is going to appraise the heavy oak desks, the vintage grandfather clock, and the cherry wood credenzas, and he will pay us cash upon removal. It keeps the assets off the official ledger and avoids unnecessary taxation. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. She was casually confessing to a premeditated scheme to steal physical property from an active estate, intending to fence historic antiques through a shady liquidator to dodge taxes. She was stealing from a ghost, and she was proudly detailing her methods into my hidden microphone. "Who is the appraiser, Mom?" I asked, my voice carrying the innocent cadence of an obedient assistant wanting to properly coordinate a schedule. "I need to know his name so I can let him through the front security gate." "His name is Marcus Vance," she replied, taking a sip of her water. "He drives an unmarked transit van. You just point him to the study, Kimberly. He will handle the heavy lifting. Make sure you are not lingering around when he does his final walkthrough." I gave a short, subservient nod, mentally logging every stolen penny she just outlined. I had the name, I had the timeline, I had the motive. The audio file currently saving to my encrypted cloud drive was a flawless piece of forensic evidence. Valerie checked her diamond-encrusted wristwatch and sighed heavily. "I have a fitting for my morning dress in 30 minutes across town," she announced, standing up and smoothing the front of her cashmere skirt. "I am leaving the luncheon tab for you to settle. Consider it your first contribution to the memorial fund." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the flagstone patio, leaving me alone at a table for two. I reached into my pocket and ended the recording. A profound sense of tranquility washed over me. I picked up the small leather billfold the server had left on the table, paid the exorbitant charge for her sparkling water, and walked out of the country club. I reached the valet stand and handed my ticket to the attendant. The afternoon sun was breaking through the heavy gray clouds. I breathed in the crisp Pennsylvania air, savoring the quiet victory of the past hour. I had successfully captured my mother weaving her own noose. Just as the valet pulled my car into the circular driveway, my phone began to vibrate in my hand. It was not a single notification. It was a rapid, relentless buzzing. A text message from my Aunt Helen. Then an incoming call from a prominent family friend. Then an email from my cousin. The screen lit up with a barrage of alerts. I unlocked the device and read the first message. The text urged me to step aside gracefully and let the men handle the complicated business affairs. The next message told me to stop being difficult during a time of family tragedy. Valerie had not just left me with the lunch bill. She had unleashed her entire social network, weaponizing the extended family to bury me under a coordinated campaign of psychological pressure. The flying monkeys had officially arrived, and they were circling. By day 4, the psychological warfare shifted from localized skirmishes into a coordinated aerial assault. My smartphone transformed into a hostile device. It vibrated relentlessly against my desk at the logistics firm where I worked, the battery draining rapidly from the sheer volume of incoming data. I watched the screen light up with a synchronized barrage of text messages, voicemails, and emails originating from extended relatives, distant cousins, and various country club acquaintances. The phrasing across all communication platforms was remarkably identical. "Step aside gracefully, Kimberly. Let the men handle the complicated business affairs. Family requires sacrifice. Stop causing your mother unnecessary grief." Valerie had clearly drafted a master script, distributing it to her loyal network of socialites and gossips. In the psychology of toxic familial structures, these enablers serve a very specific purpose. They swarm the target, creating an illusion of overwhelming consensus until the victim simply collapses under the weight of manufactured guilt. Growing up, I watched my mother utilize this exact tactic to destroy my aunt when she tried to contest a minor land dispute. She was ostracized from Sunday dinners, frozen out of holiday galas, and bombarded with phone calls until she signed away her rights just to buy back a shred of peace. Valerie wielded social exile like a blunt instrument. I knew exactly what they wanted today. They needed me to break. They needed me to hand over my administrative access without forcing them to spend money on litigators who might uncover their ongoing fraud. I walked out of my office building later that afternoon, stepping onto the concrete sidewalk and wrapping my trench coat tighter against the brisk Pennsylvania wind. A pristine silver luxury sedan idled illegally in the loading zone near the parking garage. The driver's side window rolled down smoothly, revealing the impeccably styled profile of Mrs. Gable. She was a prominent ally to my parents, a woman whose entire existence revolved around hosting charity galas and enforcing neighborhood association rules with ruthless precision. She stepped out of the vehicle, intentionally blocking my path to the pedestrian crosswalk. She offered a smile that contained zero warmth, a predatory stretching of lips over perfectly veneered teeth. The cloying scent of heavy floral perfume hit the cold air, masking the exhaust fumes from the busy street. "Oh, Kimberly, you look thoroughly exhausted," Mrs. Gable crooned, stepping closer and placing a heavily ringed hand on my forearm. Her grip was tight, an unspoken physical threat wrapped in maternal concern. "Your mother is sick with worry over you. This entire legal battle is tearing your poor family apart. Wallace would be devastated to see you acting so selfishly." She leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, scanning the sidewalk to ensure no coworkers were listening. "Derek needs the keys to your grandfather's vintage car collection," she instructed smoothly. "He wants to move the vehicles to a climate-controlled storage facility in Philadelphia for safekeeping before the estate goes public. Just hand over the keys, sweet girl. Stop making this harder than it has to be." The demand was staggering in its audacity. Derek wanted to joyride or quietly pawn a collection of classic automobiles worth $500,000 under the guise of safekeeping. The old version of me, the invisible daughter conditioned to please, would have argued. She would have cited the law, shed tears of sheer frustration, and eventually crumbled under the public embarrassment of fighting a wealthy socialite on a busy city sidewalk. The auditor standing in those shoes today saw a perfect opportunity. I needed to buy time. I needed Charles and Derek to lower their defenses and stop tracking my movements while Arthur Caldwell finalized the blind trust documentation in Philadelphia. I had to feed them a surrender so sweet they would choke on it without realizing they swallowed a hook. I let my shoulders drop. I physically deflated, allowing the tension to drain from my spine, so I appeared small, fragile, and thoroughly beaten. I directed my gaze downward, staring at her expensive leather loafers, forcing my voice to tremble with the hollow resignation of a woman who possessed nothing left to fight with. "You are right, Mrs. Gable," I whispered, letting out a ragged sigh. "I cannot handle this stress anymore. The pressure is too much for me. Tell my dad I am done fighting. Tell him I will sign my corporate proxy over to Derek tomorrow morning." Mrs. Gable released my arm instantly. The predatory tension vanished from her posture, replaced by a radiant, triumphant glow. She patted my shoulder, a gesture reserved for a subdued, obedient pet. "That is the smart choice, Kimberly," she purred. "I will let Charles know immediately. The family will be whole again soon." She slid back into her silver sedan and drove away, eager to deliver the news of her successful ambush. I walked to my car, got inside, and locked the doors. I pulled out my phone, opening the family group chat. I sat in the driver's seat and watched the screen. Within 15 minutes, the relentless barrage of notifications ceased entirely. The digital silence was profound. My mother, my father, my brother, and their entire network of sycophants stopped their harassment. They were undoubtedly popping champagne. They were gloating. They had successfully bullied the weak link into handing over the keys to the kingdom. They grew sloppy, celebrating a victory they had not actually earned. Charles and Derek were so blinded by their own greed they forgot to verify the mechanics of the document I promised to submit. In the complex world of corporate logistics, signing over a voting proxy for a publicly traded subsidiary is not a simple transfer of power. Our manufacturing firm held several highly regulated federal logistics contracts. Submitting that specific proxy form automatically triggers an internal compliance review by the Securities and Exchange Commission to ensure no hostile restructuring is taking place. The regulations are rigid and unforgiving. By sending a message that I was filing that paperwork, I was not surrendering the company. I was effectively locking the corporate vault from the inside and handing the combination dial directly to federal regulators. The moment Derek attempted to use that proxy signature to sell shares to his fictitious private equity firm, he would trigger an automatic federal audit of his entire financial history. The shadow debt hanging over his head would be exposed to government investigators before the weekend finished. I fed them a red herring, and they swallowed it whole. I leaned my head against the leather steering wheel and let out a long, slow breath. The paper trail was secured. The federal trap was baited. But corporate shares were only half the battle. While Charles and Derek were distracted by their false victory regarding the proxy, they would soon turn their greedy eyes toward the physical assets left unsecured in Lancaster. Wallace kept original paper stock certificates, century-old property deeds, and a cache of unregistered bearer bonds hidden inside his primary study at the farm. If my father found those untraceable items, he could liquidate them for untaxed cash without triggering any alarms from the SEC or the probate courts. I started the engine of my car, shifting the gear into drive. I needed to reach the historic farmhouse and empty the hidden floor safe before Charles realized the proxy maneuver was a ticking bomb. The psychological warfare phase was over. The physical race had just begun, and I was speeding directly into enemy territory. The drive to the historic Lancaster County property took 30 minutes, but it felt entirely disconnected from the modern world. The Pennsylvania farmlands unrolled outside my windshield in vast, quiet stretches of golden autumn wheat and ancient oak trees. My grandfather had built his manufacturing empire from this very residence. The Fieldstone farmhouse was constructed in the late 19th century, standing as a physical testament to a lifetime of disciplined labor. The autumn air bit sharply at my cheeks as I walked up the porch steps and unlocked the heavy oak front door. My objective today was singular and critical. I needed to secure the physical stock certificates and vintage bearer bonds hidden inside the floor safe before my father realized my proxy maneuver was a decoy. I navigated the familiar quiet corridors toward the primary study. The room smelled of old paper pipe tobacco and lemon polish. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound ledgers and engineering manuals. I dropped to my knees and rolled back the heavy Persian rug, exposing the hidden steel vault sunken into the floorboards. My fingers moved swiftly over the cold metal dial, inputting the combination Wallace had whispered to me that morning. The heavy locking mechanism clicked open with a satisfying thud. I reached inside the dark cavity and retrieved the thick stacks of parchment. The vintage bearer bonds felt brittle against my fingertips. I slipped the priceless documents into my leather tote, securing the zipper. The rural silence shattered instantly. The distinct, harsh crunch of tires sliding across the gravel driveway echoed through the property. A vehicle had braked hard right outside the bay windows. I moved to the glass remaining behind the sheer lace curtains. A sleek black SUV sat idling near the porch. Charles stepped out of the driver's seat. Derek scrambled out of the passenger side, moving with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. They were hours early. They were supposed to be back in the city, drinking scotch and celebrating my false surrender. Instead, they had driven straight to the source of the wealth. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I calculated my escape routes. The rear kitchen exit was too far away. Sprinting across the open back pasture offered zero cover. If they caught me carrying a bag full of untraceable bonds, Charles would easily spin a narrative to the local authorities that I was robbing a grieving household. I would be arrested before the sun went down. I grabbed my tote bag and darted out of the study into the adjoining hallway. My eyes locked onto the historic dumbwaiter built into the wall. Generations ago, staff used the mechanical pulley system to transport hot meals from the basement kitchen up to the dining chambers. The wooden box was narrow designed for silver trays, not a grown woman. I had no other choice. I contorted my shoulders, sliding backward into the tight, claustrophobic space. The air inside the shaft smelled of ancient pine dust and dry rot. I pulled my knees tightly against my chest, gripping the leather tote against my stomach. I reached out and dragged the wooden slatted door shut just as the front doorknob rattled loudly. The heavy hinges shrieked open. Leather dress shoes stomped onto the foyer hardwood. Derek was breathing hard, letting out ragged, panicked sounds. "We need to find the physical shares, right now," he demanded, his voice echoing down the corridor. "The private equity buyers want proof of total liquidation capability by tonight, or they withdraw the cash offer entirely," Charles replied with icy composure. "Stop sweating on the floor, Derek." The old man kept a secondary vault in his study. He wrote the combination inside a medical journal on his desk. "We grab the paper, assets, sell them through a discreet broker, and walk away with clean capital." Through the narrow horizontal slits of the dumbwaiter door, I watched them enter the study. My father moved with ruthless precision. My brother operated on pure, feral desperation. Derek began pulling out desk drawers, dumping their contents onto the expensive rugs. Antique fountain pens, handwritten letters, and framed photographs crashed against the ground. The glass covering a picture of my late grandmother shattered. Derek did not flinch. He kicked the broken frame aside, desecrating a lifetime of memories, looking for quick cash to save his own skin. "Check under the floorboards," Charles ordered, his tone devoid of any respect for the home he grew up in. "Tear up the carpet if you have to. We are not leaving without those bearer bonds." I remained perfectly still in the stifling dark. A sharp cramp formed in my left calf muscle, but I refused to shift my weight. The wooden box creaked faintly under my shoes. Derek stopped tearing at the Persian rug. He froze in the center of the ruined study. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice spiking with sudden paranoia. He stepped out of the study, walking slowly toward the hallway where I was hiding. My throat closed. The oxygen in the small wooden box suddenly felt inadequate. If he opened the slatted door, the audit would end in a physical confrontation I could not possibly win. He stopped 3 feet away from my hiding spot. I could hear his shallow breathing. I could see the expensive fabric of his suit trousers through the wooden slats. At that exact second, the towering Appalachian grandfather clock standing at the far end of the hall began to toll. It struck the hour. The deep, resonating bronze chime vibrated through the floorboards, flooding the corridor with deafening sound. It was a heavy, rhythmic noise that rattled the glass in the window frames. I seized the opportunity. Using the booming resonance of the clock to cover my movements, I slipped my smartphone from my jacket pocket. I angled the device, carefully sliding the camera lens right up to the gap between the wooden slats. I tapped the red record button. The screen illuminated slightly, capturing a crystal-clear view of the study and the hallway. Derek jumped at the sound of the clock cursing under his breath. He retreated into the room, frustrated by his lack of findings. He hurled a leather reading chair across the space. "It is gone!" he shouted, pointing at the open floor vault. "The safe is completely empty. Someone has already been here." Charles stood perfectly still amid the wreckage. He did not look angry. He looked calculating, shifting his strategy in real time. "It does not matter," my father stated flatly, brushing a speck of dust off his lapel. "The physical shares were merely a bonus. We still hold the deed to this entire property. The real money is walking through the front door in 5 minutes. Derek wiped a line of sweat from his forehead. Who is coming? A heavy car door slammed shut outside. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel approaching the porch steps. Charles adjusted his necktie, staring toward the entrance. A man who specializes in making historic problems disappear, he answered. The recording icon on my phone pulsed a steady bright red. My family had just invited a predator into our home, and I was about to capture every single word of their conspiracy. The wooden slats of the dumbwaiter pressed hard against my spine. I kept my breathing shallow, inhaling the scent of decades-old dust and dry rot. My arms ached from holding the smartphone steady, but my thumb remained locked near the recording icon. The bright red circle on the screen was the only source of light in my cramped hiding spot. Through the narrow horizontal gaps in the door, the primary study looked like a war zone. Derek had destroyed a lifetime of curation in his frantic search for the physical bonds. Now a third set of footsteps echoed across the oak threshold. The newcomer possessed a heavy, uneven stride. He walked into the frame of my camera lens carrying a battered leather briefcase. This was the broker Charles had mentioned. He did not look like the polished executives my father usually associated with at the country club. The man wore an ill-fitting gray suit and sensible rubber-soled shoes designed to navigate muddy construction sites rather than corporate boardrooms. He exuded the distinct oily confidence of a professional who specialized in making zoning laws disappear. Charles greeted him with a curt nod, addressing him as Elias. Elias Thorne was a known entity in the dark corners of the Pennsylvania commercial real estate market. My firm had flagged several of his logistics warehouses during compliance audits years ago. He facilitated transactions that existed entirely in the gray margins of the law, moving distressed properties between shell companies before the state tax agencies could catch the scent. Charles brushing shoulders with a man like Elias meant the strategy had shifted from simple theft to active, premeditated fraud. Elias set his briefcase onto the ruined surface of my grandfather's desk, ignoring the scattered family photographs and broken glass littering the floor. "Are you certain the old man is out of the picture?" Elias asked. His voice was a low, grating rasp, like stones grinding together. "I cannot risk moving forward if there is any chance of a contested deed." My father laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that reverberated off the bookshelf walls. "The coroner has the body," Charles replied, stepping directly onto the shattered frame of my grandmother's portrait. The glass crunched under his expensive loafer. He did not even look down. "I hold the medical directive and the emergency executive petition. The estate is mine to carve up. Do you have the routing numbers for the initial deposit?" Derek stepped forward, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "The residential developers are wiring the holding fee today, right?" he asked, his voice pitching high with desperation. "I need my percentage by Monday morning. I have an arrangement to settle." Charles turned slowly, leveling a look of pure contempt at his son. "Residential developers," my father sneered. "You lack vision, Derek. Subdividing 100 acres of farmland into luxury housing takes 3 years of permits, environmental surveys, and soil testing. I am not waiting 3 years to cash out my inheritance. The buyers are not building neighborhoods." Elias unclasped the brass latches of his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of topographical maps and spread them over the mahogany desk. "The buyers represent a commercial biohazard disposal conglomerate out of Ohio," Elias explained, tracing a thick finger across the property lines drawn on the paper. "They have been searching for a discreet, rural location to construct a regional medical waste incineration facility. This farm is isolated, positioned near major freight routes, and possesses unmonitored well access." The air inside my lungs turned to ice. A medical waste facility. My grandfather had spent half a century preserving this specific acreage. These rolling hills contained ancient oak groves, fertile soil, and freshwater streams that fed into the local reservoir. Wallace loved every single blade of grass on this property. He hosted community harvest festivals here. Charles was not just selling a physical asset, he was arranging to pave over a century of our heritage with concrete and toxic incinerators. It was a spiteful, calculated desecration. My father was willing to salt the earth of his own legacy merely to fill his pockets with untraceable cash. Elias tapped the map. The zoning board will ask difficult questions, he warned. They despise heavy industrial zoning this close to the agricultural reserve. The local council will attempt to block an incinerator project the moment the permits go public. Charles waved his hand, dismissing the concern with arrogant ease. The council will not pose a threat, Charles stated smoothly. We are hosting a grand celebration of life this weekend. I have invited the mayor, the township supervisors, and the entire manufacturing elite of Lancaster. I'm going to stand at the podium and play the grieving visionary son. I will announce a plan to rezone the farm under a newly formed Industrial Heritage Trust. They will rubber stamp the approvals based on my father's pristine reputation. Once the paperwork clears the municipal office next week, I will quietly dissolve the trust and sign the deed over to your biohazard clients. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Charles intended to weaponize my grandfather's funeral to fast-track the destruction of his home. The payout would be staggering. 8 figures of untaxed, unregulated offshore cash, bypassing the probate courts entirely. No waiting periods, no legal battles, just an immediate injection of capital purchased with the ashes of our history. I gripped my smartphone tight, my knuckles aching. The heavy metal casing of my red auditing pen pressed hard into my thigh through the fabric of my trousers. The physical sensation grounded me in the dark box. For the past 4 days, I believed I was fighting a defensive war over money and corporate shares. I realized, in this stifling, dusty shaft, that the stakes were infinitely higher. I was fighting to protect the soul of our family. Elias folded the maps and returned them to his battered briefcase. Have the execution papers ready by Monday morning, Charles the broker instructed, snapping the brass latches shut. My clients will route the initial $7 million deposit to the holding company the second you provide proof of unilateral authority. Derek let out a sharp, ragged breath. Monday, he repeated, fixating on the timeline like a drowning man staring at a rescue boat. It has to be Monday. Charles glared at his son, disgust radiating from every line of his posture. Stop acting like a frightened animal, Charles hissed. Go back to your condominium and stay out of sight until the memorial service. The 3 men turned and walked out of the study. Their footsteps retreated down the long corridor, growing fainter until the heavy front door opened and slammed shut. Engines turned over in the driveway. Tires crunched against the gravel, accelerating away toward the main highway. I waited a full 5 minutes in the unbroken silence before I pushed the slatted wooden door open. My legs trembled as I stepped out of the dumbwaiter, my muscles screaming in protest from holding the cramped position. I tapped the screen of my phone, ending the recording and instantly uploading the audio file to my secure cloud server. The evidence was pristine. The conspiracy was fully documented. I stood in the ruined study, looking down at the shattered glass covering my grandmother's portrait. I reached down and carefully picked up the photograph, wiping the dust from her face. Charles thought he held the unilateral authority to destroy this place. He did not know. The deed he planned to sign next week currently sat locked inside an irrevocable blind trust bearing my signature. I placed the photograph gently onto an upright chair. A new, urgent puzzle emerged from the audio file. Derek was operating on a razor-thin margin of terror. The raw panic in his voice when he demanded his share of the medical waste payout by Monday morning was unnatural. Corporate executives in debt to standard financial institutions do not sweat through their suits. They hire lawyers to negotiate repayment plans. Derek was acting like a man who feared for his physical safety. I slung my leather tote over my shoulder, patting the pocket holding the vintage bearer bonds. I walked out the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The crisp autumn wind whipped across the porch, carrying the scent of dried leaves and impending rain. I descended the wooden steps and climbed into my sedan. As I drove away from the property, my mind rapidly sorted the data points I had just gathered. Elias Thorne was a dangerous variable, a man who possessed the municipal connections to facilitate true devastation. My father provided the corrupt vision, while the broker supplied the logistical poison. But Derek was the unstable element in their chemical equation. His terror was the crack in their armor. I navigated the winding, rural roads back toward Lancaster, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The digital breadcrumbs Derek left behind during his morning ambush at my townhouse were waiting on my secure server. He had carelessly boasted about his buyers giving me enough context to pull the digital strings. I needed to cross-reference his financial footprints with the state corporate registry. Somebody was squeezing the golden boy until he cracked, and I was going to find out exactly who owned the vice. The audit was shifting from defensive maneuvers into an active, aggressive hunt. I pulled my sedan into the narrow garage attached to my Lancaster townhouse, shifting the gear shift into park with a sharp click. The evening sky outside had bruised into a deep, stormy purple, bringing a heavy chill to the Pennsylvania air. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, my hands gripping the leather rim. My pulse still hummed with the residual adrenaline of hiding inside that dusty wooden shaft. The vintage bearer bonds rested securely inside my leather tote bag on the passenger seat. I had captured the physical assets and secured the audio evidence. I unlocked the interior door and stepped into the warm glow of my kitchen. Wallace sat at the dining table, a reading lamp illuminating the thick pages of a historical biography. He looked up, his pale blue eyes searching my face for any sign of fracture. I offered a single steady nod. He closed his book, asking no questions, trusting the auditor to do her job. I moved straight to my home office. It was a sterile, highly organized space, dominated by dual monitors and a heavy mahogany desk. I set the bearer bonds inside a fireproof lockbox and booted up my workstation. The real warfare in modern America does not happen in alleyways with drawn weapons. It happens on glowing screens in offshore registries and buried deep within encrypted spreadsheets. I connected my smartphone to the computer and uploaded the audio file captured from the dumbwaiter. I fed the recording into my master audit spreadsheet, transcribing the exact quotes, dates, and dollar amounts Elias, the corrupt broker, had discussed. The plot to sell the historic farmlands to a commercial medical waste facility was horrifying. It was a calculated desecration of a century-old legacy. Yet, as I analyzed the transcribed text, one glaring discrepancy refused to align with the rest of the data. Derek and his frantic, ragged breathing. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the lines of text. During his ambush at my townhouse, my brother had bragged about a private equity buyout. Today, at the farmhouse, he had begged for a swift payout to settle a desperate arrangement. He needed an enormous sum of cash by Monday morning. I tapped my red auditing pen against the edge of the desk. Corporate executives in temporary financial distress do not sweat through their tailored suits. They do not tear apart historic studies looking for loose paper to pawn. They hire defense attorneys. They negotiate structured repayment plans. Derek was acting like a man who feared for his physical safety. I opened a new tab on my browser. During his visit to my basement door, Derek had carelessly flashed a digital document on his phone, attempting to intimidate me with his supposed private equity contacts. My trained eyes had caught a glimpse of a specific routing number and a partial corporate identification code. In the world of supply chain auditing, a partial number is a glowing neon sign pointing straight toward the buried treasure. I logged into a specialized commercial database, a tool I frequently utilized to track fraudulent vendors attempting to hide behind shell corporations. I inputted the routing digits Derek had inadvertently revealed. The search query spun for 10 seconds before generating a match. The numbers belonged to a private lending syndicate registered in Delaware under the name Apex Holdings, LLC. Delaware is the premier domestic tax haven for American corporations. The state laws allow entities to register businesses without publicly disclosing the names of the true owners. It is a feature designed to protect privacy, but it is routinely exploited to mask illicit behavior. Apex Holdings was a ghost. It possessed no website, no public board of directors, and no physical storefront. It existed merely as a post office box in Wilmington and a bank account designed to receive untraceable wire transfers. Derek owed $400,000 to this faceless entity. A shadow syndicate was threatening to break his legs if he failed to produce the cash by Monday morning. I needed to pierce the corporate veil. I pulled up the state registry and pulled the original incorporation charter for Apex Holdings. While the true owners were hidden, every LLC must list a registered agent, a designated person authorized to accept legal mail on behalf of the company. The registered agent listed on the Apex Holdings charter was a boutique corporate compliance firm located in downtown Philadelphia. I felt a cold prickle of recognition at the base of my neck. I opened a third window on my monitor and accessed the employee directory for that specific compliance firm. I scanned the list of senior partners, cross-referencing their names with the archived emails on my own hard drive. I found the match. The senior partner acting as the registered agent for Apex Holdings was a man named Richard Vance. Richard Vance was not a stranger to our family. He was the primary external defense attorney retained by Charles for the past 2 decades. He was my father's most trusted legal fixer. The air in my home office grew thin. The temperature in the room plummeted. I pushed my chair away from the desk, my lungs refusing to expand. A wave of profound nausea washed over me, forcing me to grip the edge of the mahogany wood just to remain upright. The predatory lending syndicate threatening my brother was not a cartel. It was not a ruthless underground loan shark. It was Charles. My father had secretly purchased his own son's debt through a Delaware shell company. He was using Richard Vance to mask his identity, actively extorting Derek with violent, anonymous threats. Charles knew his son was weak, reckless, and easily manipulated by terror. By playing the role of the invisible, looming predator, Charles manufactured the exact crisis needed to force Derek into total compliance. Derek was frantic to sell the pristine Pennsylvania farmlands to a medical waste facility because he believed a syndicate was going to destroy him if he missed the Monday deadline. He had no idea the monster holding the leash was sleeping in the master bedroom of his childhood home. I stood up and walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass pane. The rain had started again, tapping a chaotic rhythm against the exterior siding. For 32 years, I believed my family was simply selfish. I thought they were arrogant, status-obsessed socialites who viewed me as a disposable servant. I was wrong. The layers of rot were infinitely deeper than mere arrogance. My father was a sociopath, orchestrating a psychological torture campaign against his own flesh and blood. Charles was playing puppet master, entirely willing to push his son to the brink of a nervous breakdown merely to secure a signature on a real estate deed. He created the panic, he provided the solution, and he intended to pocket the untaxed offshore millions while Derek thanked him for saving his life. They were not a family. They were a crime syndicate sharing a genetic code. The revulsion I felt slowly morphed into something hard, cold, and razor-sharp. The last lingering shred of guilt I harbored about locking away their inheritance evaporated into the ether. I walked back to my desk and saved the Apex Holdings documentation to my encrypted drive. I now possessed the exact leverage required to fracture their unholy alliance. If Derek discovered his own father was the predator threatening his physical safety, the ensuing explosion would shatter their united front into 1,000 irreparable pieces. But I could not detonate that bomb in a private living room. A private confrontation would allow Charles to spin a web of plausible deniability. He would gaslight Derek into believing it was a misunderstanding, a protective measure taken out of paternal love. No. A revelation of this magnitude required a stage. It required an audience of their peers. It required witnesses who could never unsee the monster hiding behind the tailored navy suit. I checked the digital calendar synchronized to my phone. Tomorrow was the 7th day. Tomorrow was the grand celebration of life my mother had meticulously organized at the gilded Philadelphia banquet hall. 150 members of the Pennsylvania manufacturing elite were scheduled to attend. City council members, regional politicians, and wealthy investors would gather to mourn Wallace and anoint Charles as the new visionary leader of the empire. Charles intended to use that solemn memorial service to publicly consolidate his stolen power. He planned to stand at a microphone, shed crocodile tears, and announce his unilateral control over the legacy he was actively preparing to pave over with toxic waste. I picked up my red auditing pen and rolled the smooth metal between my fingers. The ink was fully loaded, the ledger was thoroughly investigated. Every fraudulent transaction, every shadow debt, and every recorded conspiracy sat waiting inside my leather folder. I turned off my desk lamp, letting the glow of the dual monitors cast long shadows across the walls. I was ready to attend a funeral for a living man, and I was going to ensure my father delivered his own eulogy. The 7th day arrived wrapped in a bitter, biting frost that seemed to seep directly through the limestone foundation of the Philadelphia banquet hall. Charles had won his artificial race against the autopsy clock. He secured his venue, gathered his audience, and prepared his stage. I walked through the gilded double doors of the Heritage Room just before noon, slipping into the shadows of the back row. The space was designed to project unquestionable authority. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over 150 of Pennsylvania's most influential manufacturing elites. State senators, union presidents, and regional supply chain executives mingled in tailored dark suits and designer morning dresses. The atmosphere felt suffocating, weighed down by the overpowering scent of imported white lilies and unadulterated hypocrisy. This was not a memorial service honoring a departed patriarch. This was a high society networking event disguised as a funeral, orchestrated by a family eager to count their anticipated wealth. I sat quietly in a velvet upholstered chair near the rear exit, remaining entirely unnoticed by the swirling crowd. My heavy leather folder rested flat across my lap. I retrieved my red auditing pen, tracing the smooth metal barrel with my thumb, and watched my relatives perform their assigned roles. Valerie held court near the front row. She wore a tailored black gown that draped elegantly to the floor, accessorized with a subtle diamond necklace and a crisp linen handkerchief. She played the weeping matriarch with terrifying perfection. Whenever a prominent guest approached, her shoulders would slump, and she would dab the corner of her eye with practiced fragility. Yet my vantage point offered a clear view of her hands. I watched the mayor of Lancaster lean in to offer his condolences. As they pulled away from the embrace, Valerie slipped a small, embossed rectangular card into his palm. It was the contact information for the commercial developer eyeing the surrounding township acreage. She was actively brokering real estate deals over the imaginary fresh grave of her father-in-law. Her grief was a currency she traded for zoning favors. Across the aisle, Derek presented a stark contrast to his mother's smooth diplomacy. My brother stood near the mahogany bar, gripping a glass of sparkling water. He did not mingle. He did not smile. He checked his luxury wristwatch every 3 minutes, his knee bouncing in a rapid, restless rhythm. Tomorrow was Monday. The shadow deadline imposed by Apex Holdings loomed less than 24 hours away. He believed a ruthless lending syndicate was preparing to dismantle his life if he failed to produce $400,000. He had no idea the monster holding his debt was currently adjusting a silk tie just 10 feet away. Derek wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead, looking less like a mourning grandson and more like a cornered animal waiting for a trap to spring. A sharp, electronic whine echoed through the banquet hall as someone adjusted the audio equipment. The low murmur of conversation faded into respectful silence. The guests took their seats. Charles walked up the carpeted steps to the elevated podium. He stood beneath the spotlight, gripping the edges of the wooden lectern, and bowed his head for a long theatrical moment. When he finally looked up, his expression was a masterclass in fabricated sorrow. My father began his eulogy by recounting the humble beginnings of the family empire. His voice boomed through the speakers, steady and resonant. He spoke of Wallace and his unmatched vision, detailing how a single steel mill in the rolling hills transformed into a cornerstone of the regional economy. He painted a picture of a man deeply connected to the Pennsylvania soil, a patriarch who cherished the pristine agricultural heritage of the farmlands. The dramatic irony was so thick it felt tangible. I sat in the back row, my pen hovering over my ledger, listening to a man praise the sacred nature of a property he was actively planning to pave over with a commercial medical waste incinerator. He spun a narrative of profound respect while intending to salt the earth of his own legacy for a tax-free offshore payout. The sheer sociopathy required to stand in front of 150 people and deliver such an impassioned poetic lie was staggering. Charles paused, taking a slow sip from a glass of water, letting the emotional weight of his words settle over the audience. Women in the front rows reached into their purses for tissues. Businessmen nodded with solemn approval. My father had the entire room eating out of the palm of his hand. Then he initiated the pivot. The eulogy seamlessly transitioned into a hostile corporate takeover. Wallace always looked toward the future Charles articulated, his tone shifting from mourning to executive authority. In his final days, his greatest concern was the stability of the enterprise we built together. He knew the market remains unforgiving to hesitation. He understood that leadership cannot endure a vacuum, not even for a moment of grief. Charles locked eyes with the prominent board members seated in the second row. He raised his chin, projecting the image of a reluctant but dutiful successor. It was his dying wish that this company experience zero interruption, Charles announced, his voice echoing off the gilded ceiling. To honor that request and to secure the livelihood of every worker depending on our factories, my son Derek and I will be assuming immediate total control of all corporate operations today. We are bypassing the standard transition period. Effective this afternoon, we will execute an emergency board resolution to consolidate executive power and guide this empire into a new, prosperous era. The banquet hall erupted. It did not start as polite, respectful clapping. It was a deafening wave of applause from sycophants, investors, and political allies eager to curry favor with the new reigning monarch. Men stood up, cheering for the bold, decisive action of a son taking the helm in a time of crisis. Valerie beamed from the front row, her fake tears vanishing, replaced by a radiant glow of pure, unadulterated triumph. Derek finally let out a long breath, a genuine smile cracking his pale face, believing his salvation had just been officially sanctioned. They thought they had crossed the finish line. They thought the crowd's approval cemented their theft into reality. I did not clap. I did not move. I simply looked down at the open page of my leather ledger. I had documented every stolen asset, every fraudulent document, every shell company, and every recorded conspiracy. The audit was finished. The data was verified. I capped my red pen. The sharp, metallic click was swallowed by the roaring applause, but to my ears, it sounded like a lock snapping shut on a steel cage. The trap was fully set. Charles raised his hands to quiet the room, thanking them for their unwavering support. He announced that a private reception would follow in the adjoining hall for the guests. However, he requested that the corporate board members and the estate attorney join him downstairs for a brief administrative meeting. He wanted the ink dry on his new executive titles before the sun set. I slipped my pen into my pocket and stood up from my velvet chair. The time for hiding in dumbwaiters and listening in the shadows was over. It was time to walk down to the mahogany boardroom, lay my ledger on the table, and let the dead man speak. The deafening applause inside the heritage room had barely begun to subside when my father made his move. He did not linger to shake hands with the remaining city council members or wait for the catering staff to clear the crystal champagne flutes. The public spectacle had served its purpose perfectly, providing the camouflage of social approval he desperately craved. Now he required the legal ink to dry before the illusion could shatter. I was walking toward the main exit, keeping a measured pace alongside Arthur Caldwell. The veteran estate attorney projected an aura of impenetrable calm, his leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand. Arthur had spent 3 decades navigating the treacherous waters of corporate succession planning. He knew how to spot a fraud from a mile away. Before we could reach the velvet ropes of the lobby, Charles intercepted us. He moved with the aggressive territorial stride of a man who believed his coronation was already complete.
"We are convening downstairs right now," Charles commanded, stepping directly into Arthur's path to block our exit.
His voice was stripped of the poetic sorrow he had just broadcasted to the crowd. He sounded sharp, transactional, and ruthlessly impatient. I secured the private executive suite on the lower level. Bring the final transition documents. We are executing the transfer of power before the banks open on Monday morning. Arthur did not blink. He adjusted his silk tie with a slow, deliberate movement, playing his assigned role to absolute perfection. "As you wish, Charles," the lawyer replied, his tone perfectly neutral. "Lead the way." The descent into the lower level of the banquet facility felt like a literal journey into the underworld. We stepped into a brass-plated elevator. The moment the polished doors slid shut, sealing us away from the prying eyes of the public, my family dropped their masks of grief entirely. Valerie pulled a compact mirror from her designer clutch, checking her lipstick and complaining about the subpar quality of the salmon appetizers. She spoke about the funeral catering with the casual annoyance of a woman reviewing a mediocre restaurant. Growing up, my mother treated every family milestone as a competitive sport. Birthdays, graduations, and now funerals were simply networking opportunities designed to elevate her status among the Pennsylvania elite. She lacked the capacity to mourn anything that could not be worn, spent, or leveraged. Derek leaned against the brass railing of the elevator car. A greedy, entitled smirk stretched across his face. The paralyzing terror that had gripped him earlier in the week was gone, replaced by the dangerous euphoria of a desperate man who believes his salvation is imminent. He needed $400,000 by tomorrow. He thought the corporate accounts were about to unlock, saving him from the shadow syndicate threatening his life. He had no clue the predator holding his leash was currently standing right next to him, checking the time on a luxury wristwatch. The elevator chimed and the doors parted to reveal a subterranean corridor lined with dark wood paneling. Charles marched down the hallway, leading us into a sprawling, windowless conference room. The space was designed for high-stakes corporate warfare. A massive mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by heavy leather chairs. The air felt suffocating, thick with the smell of furniture polish and unearned arrogance. The seating arrangement unfolded as a blatant display of hierarchy. Charles claimed the large armchair at the head of the mahogany table, positioning himself as the undisputed monarch of the new regime. Valerie took the seat immediately to his right, placing her designer handbag on the polished wood like a crown jewel. Derek dropped into a chair across from her, lounging backward, crossing his ankles, and drumming his fingers, a victorious rhythm on the armrest. I walked to the exact opposite end of the long table. I chose the chair furthest away from them, creating a physical divide that mirrored the vast moral canyon between us. I did not speak. I simply sat down, maintaining a posture of quiet observation, and placed my thick leather-bound folder onto the table in front of me. Arthur walked to the center of the room. He set his briefcase down, popped the brass latches, and began extracting a stack of legal files. He moved with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Every rustle of paper, every snap of a folder stretched the tension in the room tighter. My father possessed zero tolerance for delays. His entire master plan hinged on securing unilateral authority today. He had secretly negotiated the sale of our historic Pennsylvania farmland to a commercial medical waste facility, a deal brokered through corrupt back channels with a man named Elias Thorne. The buyer required proof of control to wire the offshore millions. Charles needed his signature legally recognized before the local zoning board could ask uncomfortable questions. The clock was ticking, and his patience was rapidly evaporating. "Let us skip the tedious preamble," Arthur Charles barked, waving his hand dismissively at the stack of documents. "We do not need a dramatic reading of the asset inventory. I built this company alongside the old man. I know every decimal point in the ledger. Just isolate the signature pages for the executive transition and the primary real estate deeds. Derek and I will sign them right now." Arthur picked up a pair of reading glasses, sliding them onto the bridge of his nose. He looked over the rims at my father. "The law requires a formal reading of the testamentary intent, Charles. We must establish the chain of custody for the estate to satisfy the probate courts." I said skip the formalities. Charles brought his hand down hard against the mahogany table. The sudden, sharp impact echoed like a gunshot in the enclosed room. Derek jolted in his seat, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. Valerie let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes at the lawyer's strict insistence on protocol. My father leaned forward, his face flushing with arrogant fury. He tried to physically intimidate Arthur, with his posture projecting the domineering force he used to bully regional logistics suppliers into submission. "You are a retained employee of this firm," Charles snarled, lowering his voice into a dangerous register. "Do not forget who signs your retainer checks." My father is dead. The transition protocol is active. Hand over the asset distribution signatures right this second, or I will terminate your contract the moment I assume the chairman's seat. The room went deathly quiet. The threat hung heavy in the stagnant air. Charles thought he had cornered a subordinate. He thought his intimidation tactics would easily break a cautious attorney just like he had broken countless competitors over his career. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands resting lightly on my leather folder. Inside that binder sat the audio recordings from the dumbwaiter, the proxy audit trails leading to Apex Holdings, and the irrevocable blind trust documents that legally stripped my father of everything he thought he owned. I watched the scene unfold with the detached precision of a forensic accountant observing a fraudulent transaction about to collapse. I felt no fear. I felt a profound, chilling sense of peace. Arthur Caldwell did not flinch. He did not reach for the signature pages. He did not bow to the sudden burst of executive rage. The veteran attorney simply adjusted his glasses a second time, standing tall in the center of the room. He met my father's furious gaze with an expression of mild, pitying amusement. "Before we proceed to any distribution of assets," Arthur said, his voice smooth and steady, cutting through the hostility with effortless grace, "the executor of this estate has requested to address the room personally." Charles let out a harsh, mocking scoff. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head at the perceived absurdity of the statement.
He looked at Arthur like the lawyer had just lost his mind.
"The executor is dead," Arthur Charles sneered, dripping with condescension. "You just attended his memorial service. Stop wasting my time and give me the pen." Arthur closed the file folder in front of him. He squared his shoulders, looking directly into my father's arrogant eyes. The corner of the lawyer's mouth twitched upward in the faintest shadow of a smile. "No, Charles, he isn't." The heavy brass latch on the oak doors clicked with a sharp, echoing finality. The sound severed the suffocating tension inside the mahogany-paneled conference room. The heavy wooden slabs swung inward, pulled by an unseen force, gliding silently on their polished brass hinges. Arthur Caldwell did not turn around. He simply stepped back, yielding the center of the floor, allowing the true architect of this empire to enter his domain. Wallace stepped across the threshold. He did not shuffle. He did not lean heavily against the doorframe like a frail patient fresh from a cardiac ward. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator returning to his territory. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit, the wool tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders. His silver hair was brushed back, neat and disciplined. In his right hand he held a carved wooden cane, its rubber tip finding the floor with a steady, rhythmic thud. His pale blue eyes were locked straight ahead, burning with a terrifying, righteous clarity that stripped the oxygen from the room. The reaction across the long table was cinematic. It unfolded in a sequence of visceral, uncontrollable physical responses, a symphony of collapsing egos. Valerie sat frozen in her leather chair. Her fingers adorned with expensive diamond rings simply went slack. The crystal water glass she had been holding slipped from her grasp. It plummeted toward the polished hardwood floor, shattering upon impact with a bright, musical crash. Shards of expensive glass exploded across the Persian rug, sending a spray of iced water over the toes of her designer shoes. She did not flinch. She did not reach down to clean the mess. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp, her eyes wide, staring at the ghost standing in the doorway, as if her very sanity had just fractured alongside the crystal. To her right, my father experienced a total systemic failure. Charles, the man who had just stood at a podium upstairs and confidently liquidated a century of heritage to a room full of sycophants, went entirely chalk white. The blood drained from his face so fast, his skin took on the waxy, translucent pallor of a corpse. The smug, arrogant sneer he wore just seconds prior evaporated into pure, breathless terror. His chest hitched, his lungs struggling to remember how to draw in air. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning bone white, trying to anchor himself to a reality that was actively disintegrating beneath his fingertips. Derek offered the most pathetic display of the three. My younger brother operated on a razor-thin margin of panic, haunted by the shadow debt he owed to a faceless Delaware syndicate. Seeing the man he had been plotting to rob walking toward him short-circuited his nervous system. A primal flight response kicked in. Derek planted his hands on the armrests and actually tried to stand up, desperate to flee the room. But his knees buckled. His leg muscles refused to support his weight, betraying him in his moment of supreme panic. He slumped heavily back into his leather chair, a sharp, choked whimper escaping his throat. Nobody spoke. For 30 agonizing seconds, the conference room existed in a vacuum of profound, suffocating silence. The only sounds were the ragged, shallow breathing of my brother and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique clock sitting on the credenza. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands resting lightly over my leather folder, watching them drown. This was the moment I had anticipated for 7 days. I observed their faces with the detached precision of an auditor inspecting a fraudulent ledger. I saw the exact second their brains processed the catastrophic truth. There was no autopsy. There was no death certificate. The hospital narrative was a calculated illusion. They had thrown a lavish memorial service, accepted hundreds of condolences, and attempted to steal an industrial empire from a man who was very much alive and watching their every move. Wallace began his walk. He moved along the length of the massive mahogany table, his carved cane tapping a steady beat against the hard wood. Tap, step, tap, step. The sound resembled a judge bringing down a gavel, each strike finalizing a guilty verdict. He approached the head of the table where Charles sat, paralyzed. My father finally managed to draw a shallow breath. His survival instinct, honed over decades of ruthless corporate maneuvering, tried to kick in. He opened his mouth, his jaw trembling, attempting to formulate a sentence, an excuse, a lie, anything to regain control of the narrative. "Dad," Charles choked out his voice, a hoarse, fractured whisper. "Dad, the hospital, they told us." Wallace did not stop. He did not slow his pace. He did not even turn his head to look at his son. My grandfather walked right past Charles, treating him with the ultimate devastating insult a narcissist can endure. He ignored him entirely. He rendered my father invisible. The dismissal hit Charles like a physical blow. He sank lower in his oversized chair, his broad shoulders collapsing inward. Wallace continued down the length of the wood, leaving the terrified trio in his wake. He arrived at my end of the table. He pulled out the empty leather chair situated directly to my right. The wooden legs scraped softly against the floor. He lowered himself into the seat, resting both hands over the polished handle of his cane, and leaned forward slightly. He turned his gaze down the long expanse of mahogany, locking his pale blue eyes onto the pale, sweating face of his son. "You were right," Kimberly Wallace said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a sharp, resonant power that filled every corner of the subterranean room. It sliced through the stagnant air like a scalpel, precise and lethal. 5 days was all it took for them to strip the copper from the walls. The sentence hung in the air, echoing with devastating finality. 50 years of curated social supremacy, 50 years of country club memberships, carefully managed public relations, and arrogant entitlement disintegrated in a single heartbeat. The facade was gone, leaving nothing but the ugly, exposed wiring of their greed. Valerie covered her mouth with both hands, a muffled, frantic sob escaping her lips. The theatrical fake tears she had deployed upstairs were gone, replaced by the ugly, raw reality of a woman watching her status burn to ash. Charles shook his head in slow, desperate denial. His mind scrambled to find a legal loophole, a way to spin this nightmare back into a victory. He looked toward the veteran estate attorney standing quietly near the door. Arthur Charles stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. "Arthur, what is this? What is going on here?" "The medical directive. I have the medical directive. I am the acting chief executive of this firm." Arthur Caldwell did not offer a comforting smile. He simply folded his hands in front of him, standing tall and unbothered. "A medical directive is only valid when the patient is incapacitated," Charles the lawyer explained, his tone conversational and calm. "As you can clearly see, your father is in excellent health. Your temporary authority is void." Derek let out a sharp, panicked curse. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots, his chest heaving. The realization hit him like a freight train. The corporate accounts were not unlocking today. He was not getting a cash payout. Tomorrow was Monday, and the Shatter Syndicate he owed $400,000 to was going to demand their payment. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. Wallace turned his head, looking at me. He gave a single, firm nod. It was time. The psychological shock and awe had paralyzed them. Now it was time to execute the forensic dismantling. I unclasped the brass button on my thick leather folder. I flipped the heavy cover open, revealing pristine stacks of printed emails, financial transcripts, and state registry documents. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my heavy metal auditing pen, setting it down next to the paperwork. Charles watched my movements, his eyes narrowing as a new, different kind of fear began to take root in his chest. He looked at the thick stack of evidence, then looked up at my face. He finally saw the woman sitting across from him. He did not see the quiet, obedient daughter he used to scrub his floors and manage his schedules. He saw a senior supply chain auditor preparing to present her findings to the board. "What is in that folder, Kimberly?" my father asked, his voice trembling with a terrifying suspicion. I smoothed my hand over the top page of the spreadsheet. I looked directly into his eyes, allowing him to see the cold, unyielding void where my loyalty used to reside. "Just the receipts, Dad," I replied softly. "Let us go through them, line by line." The silence broke, shattering into a chaotic chorus of panicked voices. Valerie started talking fast, her pitch rising into a shrill, hysterical frequency. She babbled about a terrible misunderstanding, pressing her hands to her chest and praising heaven for a miracle she clearly wished had never occurred. She tried to reach across the table, her diamond rings catching the overhead light, offering empty prayers of gratitude. Charles scrambled to construct a defense, his words stumbling over each other as he attempted to backtrack his previous threats. He claimed he was only trying to protect the legacy, spinning a desperate narrative about securing the assets during a period of intense grief. Wallace did not entertain the noise. He raised his carved wooden cane 2 inches off the floor and brought it down hard against the hardwood. The sharp, deafening crack echoed like a rifle shot. The sound instantly severed their frantic excuses. Valerie clamped her mouth shut, sinking back into her leather chair. Charles swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, as he stared at the patriarch he had tried to bury. Wallace kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. He did not yell. He did not berate them. He simply nodded toward me and said, "Proceed." I opened my thick leather folder, folding the cover back to reveal the neat, organized stacks of printed evidence. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I slipped into the flat, measured cadence of a seasoned supply chain auditor presenting quarterly discrepancies to a hostile board of directors. Emotion is a liability in an audit. Facts are the only currency that matters. "Exhibit A," I announced, sliding a stapled packet of financial records down the center of the mahogany table. The paper glided smoothly, coming to a halt directly in front of my father. Charles hesitated, eyeing the document as if it were a venomous snake, before slowly picking it up. "That is an aggregate report of the corporate proxy audit initiated 4 days ago," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly level. "When you believed I surrendered my voting rights, you failed to realize the submission triggered an automatic internal compliance review by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The inquiry combed through the last 6 years of executive expenditures." Charles scanned the top page, his face draining of whatever color had managed to return.
You have been treating the manufacturing firm like a personal slush fund.
I continued reciting the figures from memory. Falsified vendor invoices, inflated logistics contracts, routed to offshore holding accounts. The data proves a systemic embezzlement operation totaling just over $2.4 million since 2018. The federal regulators possess those exact copies, Dad. Your career as a corporate executive is over. If you attempt to step onto the factory floor tomorrow, the board will have you escorted out by federal marshals. My father dropped the packet. The paper hit the wood with a soft thud. He opened his mouth to formulate a denial, but the raw data stripped him of any plausible defense. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating escape routes. I did not give him time to recover. I pulled the second piece of evidence from my folder. "Exhibit B," I said, sliding 3 high-resolution, time-stamped photographs across the table toward my brother. Derek flinched as the glossy pictures slid into his view. They were still frames, pulled from the hidden security cameras I had installed at the historic Lancaster property. The images clearly depicted Derek tearing the primary study apart, his face twisted in feral desperation as he ransacked our grandfather's desk looking for bearer bonds. "You committed felony, breaking and entering on a secured property," I stated, watching my brother shrink into his seat. "You vandalized a historic site and attempted to steal unregistered securities. The local authorities have the digital files." Valerie let out a quiet gasp, staring at the photos of her golden child acting like a common burglar. "Derek, what were you doing?" she whispered, her voice laced with genuine horror. "He was looking for fast cash," I answered for her, pulling the third document from my binder. "Because he thought he was running out of time." I slid a thick stack of transcribed pages toward the center of the table, making sure everyone could read the bold text on the cover sheet. "This is the audio transcript from yesterday afternoon," I noted, my voice remaining devoid of inflection. While Derek was hunting for loose change in the study, I was sitting inside the historic dumbwaiter in the hallway. I recorded every word you and Elias Thorne discussed. Valerie frowned, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "Who is Elias Thorne?" "He is a corrupt real estate broker," I clarified, shifting my gaze to my mother. "Your husband hired him to sell the Pennsylvania farmlands. Charles was not planning to build luxury housing. To secure an immediate, untraceable cash payout and bypass probate taxes, he arranged to sell the pristine acreage to a commercial biohazard disposal conglomerate. He was going to pave over a century of our heritage with a medical waste incinerator." Valerie turned her head slowly, staring at Charles. My mother cared deeply about social standing. The idea of her husband turning the family estate into a toxic dumping ground meant her prestigious reputation among the country club elite would be permanently tainted. She saw her social empire crumbling alongside the farm. "You promised me we were selling to residential developers," Valerie hissed at him, her voice dripping with venom. "You said we would have a beautiful subdivision named after us." "I made a business decision." Charles snapped back his facade, cracking under the weight of his exposed lies. "The residential permits take years. We needed liquidity now." "No," I corrected him, tapping my finger against the final, most devastating document remaining in my folder. "Derek needed liquidity now. You just used his terror to secure your own payday." I pulled the state registry printout from the binder. I did not slide this document to the center of the table. I slid it directly to Derek. "Exhibit C," I said softly, allowing the silence in the room to amplify the weight of the moment. "The shadow debt." Derek stared at the paper. His hands shook as he picked it up. "You owe $400,000 to a private lending syndicate registered in Delaware under the name Apex Holdings," I explained, watching my brother's eyes scan the text. "They threatened to break your legs if you did not pay them by Monday morning. That is why you were desperate enough to ransack the farmhouse. That is why you were begging Charles to finalize the medical waste deal. You thought a ruthless cartel was coming to collect your life." Derek swallowed hard, nodding slowly, too terrified to speak. "Turn to the second page, Derek," I instructed. "Look at the registered agent for Apex Holdings." My brother flipped the page. His eyes traced the highlighted name at the bottom of the corporate charter. "Richard Vance." "Richard Vance is Dad's primary external defense attorney," I stated, letting the reality sink into my brother's frantic mind. "He set up the shell company on behalf of his client. Apex Holdings is not a cartel. Apex Holdings is Charles." The air left the room. Derek slowly lowered the paper. He turned his head, and his wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto his father. The profound, sickening realization washed over his features. The monster he had been running from, the predator sending anonymous threats and terrorizing his waking hours, was sitting 2 feet away. "You," Derek whispered, his voice cracking into a ragged, broken sound. "You sent those messages." You said they were going to hurt me. Charles stiffened his jaw, locking tight. I purchased your gambling debts from your bookmaker to protect the family name, my father retorted, attempting to maintain a shred of authority. You are reckless, Derek. You needed discipline. You needed to understand the consequences of your actions. You extorted me, Derek shouted, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. The fear that had paralyzed him for a week instantly transmuted into raw, unfiltered rage. He lunged forward in his chair, gripping the edge of the table. You drove me insane. You made me think I was going to die, just so I would agree to sell the farm and sign the deeds over to you. I secured the assets, Charles roared back, finally dropping his polished executive mask, revealing the ruthless tyrant underneath. You are weak. You would have folded and lost everything to strangers. I kept the leverage in-house. I sat back in my chair, watching the unholy alliance fracture in real time. My methodical dismantling had worked flawlessly. By exposing the invisible strings Charles used to control his son, I severed their bond permanently. Derek looked at his father with sheer horror and disgust. Valerie looked at her husband like he was a stranger holding a match to her social calendar. The united front they presented upstairs was now a pile of smoking rubble. They were tearing each other apart, destroying their own syndicate from the inside out. My ledger was empty. The truth was out in the open, undeniable and documented. But Charles was a cornered animal, and cornered animals do not surrender easily. He realized the room had turned against him. He realized his son was gone, his wife was alienated, and his financial crimes were packaged for federal review. His eyes darted frantically around the table, landing finally on the silent patriarch sitting beside me. My father stood up, planting his hands flat on the mahogany surface, his breathing heavy and ragged. He glared at Wallace, preparing to launch his final desperate counterattack. A dark, ugly sneer twisted his lips as he calculated his last remaining legal maneuver. The truth was devastating, but in the realm of corporate law, the truth only matters if the person speaking it is deemed competent by the state. My father stared at the patriarch sitting to my right. The desperation in Charles mutated into a dark, cornered fury. He planted his palms flat against the mahogany table, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white as he leaned his weight forward. He was a man who had spent 3 decades bending regional logistics networks to his will, and he refused to accept that a supply chain auditor had just dismantled his empire. You think this means anything? Charles spat his voice, trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and terror. You think a binder full of printed spreadsheets and a secret audio recording changes the hierarchy of this family? I am the acting chief executive. I hold the medical directive. He pointed a shaking finger at Wallace. You are unfit, he declared, raising his volume to fill the cavernous conference room. The cardiac event damaged your cognitive functions. You are senile. You are not in your right mind. I am calling Judge Harrison the second I leave this banquet hall. I will file an emergency competency hearing. I will have the state declare you medically incapacitated, and I will assume permanent conservatorship over the entire estate. You cannot stop me. Neither of you can. Charles believed he still held the ultimate trump card. In the realm of high-stakes corporate litigation, challenging the mental faculties of an aging founder is a common brutal tactic used to seize control. My father intended to drag his own father through a humiliating public medical trial, weaponizing the Pennsylvania probate courts to steal the inheritance by force. He glared at me, his chest heaving, a bead of cold sweat tracing the line of his jaw. Your little audit is a nuisance, Kimberly. It is a minor inconvenience. Once I have the conservatorship, I will bury those records in litigation for a decade. You will run out of money before we ever see the inside of a courtroom. Arthur Caldwell cleared his throat. The sound was soft, yet it sliced through my father's tirade with effortless precision. The veteran estate attorney stepped away from the wall and approached the center of the mahogany table. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a pair of silver reading glasses, slipping them onto the bridge of his nose. "You are going to find a competency hearing very difficult to initiate, Charles," the lawyer stated. His tone carried the calm, clinical authority of a surgeon preparing to make an incision. "Primarily because you no longer possess any legal standing to file the petition." Arthur opened his briefcase. He did not pull out a single sheet of loose paper. He retrieved a thick, heavy stack of documents printed on premium watermarked legal stock. A bright blue notary seal gleamed on the top page, catching the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. He set the stack onto the polished wood, sliding it precisely into the center of the table, where everyone could read the bold embossed header. Charles looked down. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the dense text. "What is this?" my father demanded, his voice losing its confident edge, reverting to a hollow rasp. "That is an irrevocable blind trust," Arthur explained, folding his hands together in a gesture of total finality. "We executed those documents 5 days ago in my downtown Philadelphia office. Your father underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation by a licensed geriatric psychiatrist that very same morning. The physician issued a sworn affidavit confirming Wallace possesses exceptional mental acuity and full testamentary capacity. That affidavit is attached to the charter as Exhibit A. Any judge in the state will throw your competency petition out before it even reaches a clerk." Derek stared at the thick stack of paper, his frantic mind, trying to calculate how this affected his shadow debt. "What does the trust do?" my brother asked, his voice cracking into a high pitch. "It changes the ownership structure of the entire empire." Arthur replied smoothly. 5 days ago, Wallace legally severed his direct ownership of the assets. The regional manufacturing firm, the historic Lancaster farmlands, the commercial real estate holdings, and all liquid capital accounts were successfully transferred into this new legal entity. Wallace no longer owns those items. The trust owns them. Charles swayed slightly on his feet. He gripped the back of his leather chair to steady himself, looking like a man who had just stepped off a ledge. "If the trust owns the assets, who controls the trust?" Arthur turned his head and looked directly at me. "Wallace is designated as the living beneficiary entitled to the yields and comforts of the estate," the attorney detailed, his words hammering the final nails into my family's coffin. "However, the sole unquestionable trustee is Kimberly. She holds full discretionary power over every physical and financial asset." The air inside the subterranean boardroom turned to lead. The reality of their defeat settled over them, crushing their remaining delusions under an immovable weight. "The forged medical directive you hold is worthless, Charles, because there are no personal accounts left to freeze," Arthur concluded, dealing the ultimate legal death blow. "The emergency board transition you announced upstairs is void. You cannot liquidate the manufacturing shares, and you cannot sell the farmland to a medical waste facility because you do not own a single brick of this empire." My father and my brother were legally disinherited. They were stripped of their corporate titles, severed from the family wealth, and left holding nothing but the toxic, illicit debts they had incurred on their own. Derek was trapped in a financial nightmare of his own making, owing $400,000 to a shadow syndicate operated by the very man standing next to him. Charles was facing federal compliance investigations for severe corporate embezzlement. They had spent a week digging a pit for my grandfather and me, and they had just realized they were standing at the bottom of it. Wallace shifted in his chair. He reached across the table, his weathered hand moving with slow, deliberate purpose. He did not pick up the newly forged trust documents. He reached for my red auditing pen. My grandfather picked up the heavy metal tool. He rolled it between his fingers, testing the weight. Then he pulled the original, outdated corporate succession charter toward him. The very document Charles had planned to sign today to crown himself king. Wallace uncapped the red pen. The metal lid clicked sharply. He pressed the felt tip against the thick parchment. With a single, fierce, unyielding stroke, he drew a thick crimson line straight through the name Charles Hughes. My grandfather tossed the ruined succession document back across the mahogany table. It slid over the polished wood and came to a stop right against my father's trembling hands. "You are fired," Charles Wallace said, his voice echoing with devastating clarity. "Clear out office." Valerie sat frozen in her seat. The color had entirely drained from her face. She looked like a porcelain doll that had just been dropped onto a concrete floor. My mother spent her entire adult life curating an image of untouchable wealth. She hosted charity galas, dictated neighborhood association rules, and used her social standing to bully anyone who dared to question her authority. She viewed the Lancaster farmlands and the manufacturing profits as her personal treasury. Now she was staring at the undeniable proof that her treasury was gone. The country club memberships, the designer morning dresses, the expensive catering bills for the fake memorial service happening right above our heads. The funding for her pristine, shallow life had just evaporated. She would have to return to her circle of elite socialites and explain why her husband was being escorted out of his own building by security. Valerie slowly turned her head. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine. For 32 years, she had looked at me and seen a docile servant. She saw a quiet girl she could dispatch to scrub vomit out of a garage, a convenient scapegoat she could blame whenever the golden boy made a mistake. She searched my face now, desperately looking for a shred of an obedient daughter, hoping I would break, apologize, and offer them a lifeline. I met her gaze. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not feel a sudden surge of guilt. I sat at the end of the long mahogany table, surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of their crimes, and I felt nothing but profound, unshakable peace. "You wanted me to handle the estate, Mom," I said quietly. The words hung in the air, severing the last invisible thread that bound me to their toxicity. "It is handled." The corporate boardroom felt vast and quiet, the silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the men who had tried to erase me. I closed my leather folder, snapping the brass clasp shut. The audit was complete. The assets were secure, and the truth was undeniable. But the shockwaves of this afternoon were destined to ripple outward. The guests upstairs were still drinking champagne, waiting for a patriarch who would never return to their stage. As Arthur Caldwell began packing his briefcase, I knew the immediate war was won, but the inevitable fallout was about to require a very different kind of strength. The ascent back to the main level of the banquet hall unfolded in a suffocating, unbroken silence. The brass elevator car, which had felt like a chariot for a conquering king just an hour prior, now served as a descending cage. I stood near the control panel, watching the polished metal doors reflect the fractured remnants of my relatives. Charles stared blankly at the floor, his shoulders stooped, his face hollowed out by the sudden, irreversible loss of his empire. The waxy pallor of his skin made him look like the very corpse he had intended to bury today. Derek kept swallowing hard, his eyes darting toward the illuminated floor numbers, operating on a frantic, primal urge to flee. Valerie gripped the brass handrail so tight her knuckles bruised her diamond rings, clicking faintly against the metal as a subtle tremor shook her entire frame. When the doors slid open, the cloying scent of imported white lilies washed over us. The primary reception had concluded. The wealthy politicians and regional manufacturing executives had returned to their respective estates, leaving behind a vast empty ballroom scattered with discarded napkins and half-empty crystal champagne flutes. The catering staff moved quietly among the tables, dismantling the theatrical production my mother had so carefully orchestrated. As we stepped onto the thick carpet of the lobby, the events director intercepted our group. He was a tall, impeccably groomed man in a tailored tuxedo, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone eager to close out a successful weekend ledger. He carried a silver tray, bearing a thick, cream-colored envelope. He approached Valerie, offering a polite, practiced nod of condolence. He extended the silver tray toward her, presenting the final, itemized invoice for the afternoon. Valerie stared at the envelope as if it were coated in poison. Her manicured hands remained glued to her sides. She turned her head, looking at Arthur Caldwell with wide, desperate eyes. Her social survival instinct kicked in, attempting to command the room one last time. "Give that to the estate attorney," she instructed, the director, her voice cracking, betraying the fragile veneer of her composure. "The trust handles all memorial expenses. Arthur processed the payment for the venue and the florals." Arthur did not reach for the silver tray. The veteran lawyer stood tall, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine navy suit. He offered my mother a look of mild, detached pity. "I cannot authorize that disbursement, Valerie," he replied, his tone smooth and unwavering. "The financial parameters of the irrevocable trust are exceptionally strict. The legal entity we established does not cover funeral expenses for living men. This event was an unauthorized personal expenditure. You ordered the prime rib. You selected the imported floral arrangements. The $35,000 balance belongs entirely to you." The color drained from her cheeks. The events director maintained his polite smile, but his eyes hardened, recognizing a client who suddenly lacked the capital to settle her tab. Valerie realized in that precise moment that her pristine country club reputation was over. She would have to drain her own dwindling personal savings to pay for a fake funeral, and the gossip surrounding her unpaid debts would spread through the Pennsylvania social elite before Monday morning. She snatched the envelope from the tray, her hands shaking so severely she nearly dropped it, and hurried toward the exit without uttering another word. Derek pushed past the heavy glass doors a few seconds later, desperate to escape the suffocating reality of the lobby. I followed at a measured pace, stepping out into the crisp, biting afternoon air. The sprawling parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few luxury sedans and the catering vans. But right in the center of the asphalt, a bright yellow tow truck sat idling its diesel engine, rumbling with a low mechanical growl. Amber warning lights swept across the pavement in rhythmic, blinding flashes. Derek stood frozen on the sidewalk. The hydraulic winch of the tow truck whined loudly, pulling a sleek, imported silver sports car onto the tilted flatbed. It was Derek's prized vehicle, the gleaming symbol of his unearned executive status. A burly recovery agent in a high-visibility jacket secured heavy steel chains around the rear axles. Derek sprinted across the asphalt, his expensive leather shoes slapping hard against the pavement. He waved his arms, shouting frantic, hollow threats at the recovery agent, demanding he release the vehicle immediately. The driver did not flinch. He simply pulled a thick clipboard from his jacket pocket and thrust it toward my brother's chest. "Your account is 90 days delinquent," the driver stated, his voice carrying over the rumble of the diesel engine. "The financing company revoked your ownership clause this morning. Sign the release form, or I call the local precinct and have you cited for interfering with a lawful recovery." My brother stared at the clipboard, his jaw trembling. He looked back toward the banquet hall, searching for the towering figure of his father to step in and fix the problem. But Charles was not coming to save him. The shadow syndicate that Derek feared, the invisible predator holding a $400,000 vice around his neck, was his own flesh and blood. And his father no longer possessed a single dime to fund his rescue. Derek was stranded in a cold parking lot, stripped of his Golden Boy armor, left holding a catastrophic debt that was now entirely his own problem to solve. The final surgical strike of the audit landed on Monday morning. I did not attend the event in person. The data was verified and my physical presence was unnecessary. Arthur Caldwell provided a detailed account of the proceedings later that afternoon. Charles arrived at the regional manufacturing headquarters at exactly 8 o'clock, determined to bluff his way into the corner office and salvage his stolen empire. He strode across the polished granite floor of the lobby, ignoring the curious stares of the administrative staff. He swiped his executive identification badge against the electronic scanner guarding the restricted elevator bank. The scanner beeped a sharp, discordant tone. A red light flashed across the digital reader. Access denied. Charles tried again, slamming the plastic card against the sensor. The red light flashed a second time. Before he could demand an explanation from the reception desk, two stern men in dark suits stepped out of the adjacent security office. They were federal compliance investigators, flanked by the building's head of private security. They handed Charles a standard cardboard moving box holding the meager personal contents of his desk. They quietly informed him that his employment was terminated, effective immediately, pending a full federal review of his 6-year embezzlement history. My father did not shout. He did not threaten to invoke his medical directive. The sheer, undeniable weight of the evidence broke his spirit right there in the lobby. He took the cardboard box, turned around, and walked out the glass sliding doors, escorted by security guards he used to command. He was exiled from the kingdom he had tried to steal, leaving the factory to hum efficiently without him. 6 months passed. The frantic chaos of that week faded into a quiet, structured routine. The Pennsylvania air turned crisp again, the heavy humidity of summer giving way to the brilliant, fiery hues of autumn. I drove out to the historic Lancaster farmlands on a Tuesday afternoon. The ancient oak trees lining the gravel driveway dropped their golden leaves across the grass. The property felt different now. It did not feel like a battlefield. It felt like a sanctuary. I walked up the wooden porch steps and opened the heavy oak front door. The familiar scent of lemon polish and pipe tobacco greeted me. In the central hallway, the towering Appalachian grandfather clock ticked with a steady, comforting rhythm, measuring out the seconds of a legacy we had successfully preserved. Wallace sat in a rocking chair on the wraparound back porch, looking out over the pristine acreage that would never see a zoning board or a medical waste incinerator. He wore a thick flannel shirt to ward off the October chill. A ceramic mug of dark roasted coffee rested on the small wooden table beside him. I pulled up a second rocking chair and sat down, wrapping both hands around my own warm mug. We did not speak for a long time. We simply watched the wind rustle the dry corn stalks in the distant fields. My mother had moved into a modest condominium across the state, her country club standing permanently revoked. Charles was currently navigating a labyrinth of federal plea deals to avoid a prison sentence, his reputation reduced to a cautionary tale in local business journals. Derek had vanished into the sprawling anonymity of the Midwest, forced to find employment that did not involve his last name. They were gone. The noise they generated, the constant, suffocating demands for compliance and unpaid labor had evaporated entirely. Setting a boundary against your own blood is a profound, terrifying undertaking. Society conditions you to believe that endurance is a virtue, that absorbing the sharp edges of your family is the rent you must pay to secure their conditional affection. I spent 32 years believing my silence was a form of loyalty. I thought maintaining the peace was my assigned duty. I learned the truth inside a dusty dumbwaiter and across a mahogany boardroom table. Peace purchased through submission is merely a hostage negotiation. You cannot fix a toxic system from the inside. You can only audit the damage, identify the fraud, and refuse to balance their broken ledgers with your own sanity. Wallace took a slow sip of his coffee. He turned his head, his pale blue eyes resting on my face. He looked at the woman sitting beside him and saw the sole untouchable warden of his legacy. I took a breath of the clean, crisp autumn air. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the auditor of my own worth, and for the first time in my life, my ledger was perfectly balanced. We are raised on a very specific, deeply American mythology regarding the traditional family. We are taught from a young age that blood is an unbreakable covenant, a sacred bond that must be preserved at all costs, regardless of the emotional toll it extracts. We picture the idealized dinner tables, the shared holidays, the generational wealth of wisdom passed down from parent to child. Yet, as the harrowing narrative of Kimberly and her grandfather so sharply illustrates, the architecture of a family can easily be warped into something entirely unrecognizable. When the foundational pillars of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness are replaced by greed, favoritism, and manipulation, the family unit ceases to be a sanctuary. Instead, it becomes a syndicate. The central tragedy of this story, and the narratives of countless men and women navigating similar domestic battlefields, is the profound failure of parenting values. True parenting, especially within the framework of a traditional American family, requires an unwavering commitment to fairness. It demands that we look at our children not as extensions of our own egos, nor as tools to be leveraged for social standing, but as distinct, autonomous individuals. When parents fail to cultivate this fairness, they often create a toxic, polarized environment, giving rise to two distinct archetypes: the golden child and the invisible child. In Kimberly's family, Derek was groomed for entitlement. He was shielded from the consequences of his own reckless actions because his parents operated under the flawed assumption that family protects family. Charles and Valerie failed to instill accountability in their son, opting instead to enable his destructive behavior. They thought they were protecting him, but in reality, they were disarming him, leaving him entirely unprepared to navigate the harsh realities of the real world. This highlights the inherent danger of raising a child without honesty. When we shield our children from their own failures, when we buy their debts or clean up their messes without demanding accountability, we are not displaying love. We are displaying a terrifying form of control, manufacturing a dependency that ultimately paralyzes them when they are forced to stand on their own. Conversely, the invisible child is tasked with absorbing the shockwaves of the family's dysfunction. They are conditioned to believe that their inherent value is inextricably linked to their utility. They become the organizers, the fixers, the silent auditors of the family's emotional and financial ledgers. For decades, Kimberly believed that absorbing the sharp edges of her parents and brother was simply the rent she had to pay to secure their conditional affection. This represents a catastrophic failure of emotional awareness in parenting. A child should never have to earn their place at the table by sacrificing their own peace, their own ambitions, or their own voice. When love is transactional, it ceases to be love. It becomes extortion dressed in domestic clothing. Long-term guidance for children in American culture must pivot away from the archaic notion of blind loyalty. We must teach our children that respect is earned through integrity, not automatically bestowed by a shared surname. We must foster emotional awareness, giving them the vocabulary to articulate their boundaries and the courage to enforce them against anyone who seeks to diminish their light. A healthy traditional family structure thrives on transparency, where mistakes are addressed openly and victories are celebrated without hidden agendas. If Charles had raised his children with honesty, he would not have felt the unholy need to extort his own son through a shadow corporation. If Valerie had valued emotional connection over country club prestige, she would not have found herself standing in an empty banquet hall, clutching a catering bill she could not pay. Their ultimate downfall was not simply the loss of a corporate empire. It was the total, irreversible loss of their humanity. As we navigate our own complex webs of kinship, we must ask ourselves difficult questions about the roles we play and the patterns we perpetuate. Are we demanding obedience, or are we cultivating mutual respect? Are we teaching our children to protect the family image at all costs, or are we equipping them to protect their own souls? These are the conversations that truly matter. If you are untangling these exact knots in your own life, if you are learning how to stop paying rent on conditional love, please know you are not navigating this treacherous journey alone. I encourage you to follow the Zara Told Stories channel. It is a community dedicated to exposing these quiet domestic realities, a safe harbor where the invisible children finally step into the light and reclaim their narratives. Subscribe, share your own experiences in the comments, and join a space where truth is consistently valued over maintaining a toxic peace. The prevailing cultural narrative insists that forgiveness is the ultimate virtue, that walking away from your bloodline is a failure of character. We are constantly bombarded with the sentimental idea that time heals all wounds and that family, no matter how deeply flawed or abusive, must always be reconciled before the end. But I offer a different perspective. Sometimes, the most profound act of love you can perform is the act of walking away. Sometimes holding on does not demonstrate strength, it merely prolongs the bleeding. We are socially conditioned to view estrangement as a tragedy, an unnatural severing of the most fundamental human connection. Yet when the roots of the family tree are entirely rotted, watering the soil is an exercise in futility. The true tragedy is not the empty chair at the holiday table. The true tragedy is sitting in that chair surrounded by people who share your DNA and feeling completely, utterly unseen. It is the quiet, soul-crushing realization that the people tasked with protecting you from the monsters of the world are, in fact, the monsters you must protect yourself against. Reclaiming your life from a toxic family structure is not an act of revenge. It is the ultimate expression of self-respect. It requires you to audit your own existence, to carefully examine the ledgers of your heart, and to bravely cross out the names of those who have bankrupted your spirit. Conventional wisdom tells us to forgive and forget to keep the peace, to smile for the sake of the photograph. But peace purchased with your own subjugation is not peace at all. It is captivity. True freedom begins the exact moment you realize that your worth was never theirs to appraise. You do not owe your life to the people who gave it to you, especially if they demand your soul as repayment. The most sacred responsibility you possess is not to your ancestry, but to the person you are becoming. And as you close the door on the house you grew up in, leaving the keys behind, in the silence you must ask yourself one final, lingering question. If you finally stop carrying the weight of their expectations, how far will you be able to fly?